Chapter 291 Eye of the Storm. The crowd poured into the castle, their faces contorted with anger and resentment. However, as soon as the slum dwellers passed beneath the swaying skulls that hung above the gates, their fury turned cold. In the echoing stone halls of the bright castle, it was hard to forget that Gunlog's power was absolute. For as long as any of them remembered, he had ruled over the Dark City with an iron fist, elevating those who bowed to him and destroying those who did not. Countless men and women had tried to challenge the Bright Lord in the past, great people, terrible people, and everyone in between. It was their skulls that now stared at the crowd, darkness nesting in their eyes. Finally, doubt and fear appeared in the hearts of the inhabitants of the outer settlement. Many of them stared at Nephice, their faces turning dim and listless. Changing Star did not react to this sudden change in one way or another. Looking straight ahead, she calmly walked forward, an indifferent expression on her face. Her usual mask was in its place once again, preventing anyone from knowing her true thoughts. Trying to remain unnoticed, Sunny made his way to the front of the crowd to be closer to Nephice, Effie, and Castor. No one paid him any attention. In the grand scheme of things, people thought of him as an insignificant piece, if at all, just like he wanted them to. From his point of view, the atmosphere in the bright castle seemed to be a bit strange, and not because of the invading horde of slum dwellers. Its halls and corridors were too empty, too lifeless. He didn't see any people hurrying on their daily business, as they always would. Even the opulent desk in the entrance hall was empty. The clerk usually presents behind it absent for some reason. Where is everyone? His question was soon answered. Entering the throne room, he saw hundreds of sleepers standing along its walls, waiting to meet them. It seemed as though the whole population of the bright castle had gathered here. There were the guards, the hunters, the artisans, the quiet handmaidens. Even people who paid tribute to remain in the castle were all there. Sunny noticed a few familiar faces. Stev, the large man in charge of the memory market, stood uncomfortably near the members of the host. There was also Iko, the owner of the gambling den, and many others whom he remembered from his brief stay in the castle. The air was tense and heavy. It seemed that not all of these people had come to the throne room of their own free will. Many of them had troubled, frightened expressions on their faces. Others were relaxed and joyful, waiting for an entertaining show with dark fascination burning in their eyes. What disturbed him the most were the several figures of nightmare creatures standing among the humans. Those were the echoes belonging to the inhabitants of the castle, each one more terrifying than the other. Why are they out of their owner's soul seas? On the raised dais at the far end of the great hall, illuminated by the false stars that were carved into the wall of the dark alcove, the 4 lieutenants of the Bright Lord stood. There was Gemma, the leader of the hunters, Keto, the chief artisan, and Saishin, who was in charge of the handmaidens. And Harus, of course. Sunny stared at the dreadful hunchback, who just stood there with his usual bored expression, looking at the wall. He was pretty sure that today at least one of them was going to die. As if feeling his gaze, Harus suddenly turned and glanced at Sunny. This time, however, Sunny did not look away. He stared straight into the hunchback's glassy eyes, a calm and calculating expression on his face. I wonder how he killed all those people without being seen, even once. With so many victims, somebody had to catch a glimpse of this butcher hard at work. What aspect ability does he possess? How do I counter it? Harus stared at him for a few moments, then tilted his head and smiled with strange amusement. A second later, he turned away and looked at the wall again, seemingly losing all interest. Meanwhile, Tessai walked to the middle of the hall and threw Effie down, forcing her to kneel on the floor. Then, he gave Nephice a dark look and joined the other lieutenants on the steps leading to the throne. The 200 or so slum dwellers were standing at one end of the throne room, their faces grim and full of dark apprehension. With the exception of those directly serving Changing Star, most of them were dressed in dirty rags, with only a few wearing proper armor. Some were unarmed, some had memories or makeshift weapons hanging on their belts, and some even had swords hastily fashioned out of the talons of the slain Spire messenger. Opposite them, with their back to the throne, stood the people of the castle. Many of them looked like they didn't want to be here, but more had contempt and indignation in their eyes. Those were mostly the members of the host, who were more than 200 people strong. Each of them was clad in a sturdy memory armor and wielded enchanted weapons. They were strong, well-fed, and experienced in combat. The hunters, especially, were a formidable presence despite their comparatively small number. They were looking at Nephice with intense hatred, the memory of her killing one of their own in this very hall still fresh in their minds. Changing Star stood beside Effie in the middle of the empty space between the two groups, looking at the white throne. Her ivory face was cold and indifferent, and her silver hair glinted in the rays of sunshine that fell through tall windows. Sparks of light were dancing in the depths of her calm gray eyes. She was the focal point of everyone's attention and the target of the dark storm of emotions that raged between the ancient walls of the castle today. If it bothered her, she did not show it. And then, finally, the bright lord himself appeared. Sunny knew that Gunnalug entered the great hall even before seeing him. He knew it because of the sudden change in the people that surrounded him. It was as though a wave of invisible pressure had crashed into the crowd, forcing them to groan and bend, almost buckling to the ground. Their legs trembled, their faces paled, and drops of sweat appeared on their skin, as well as fear and panic in their eyes. The mastermind behind this ghoulish spectacle had finally arrived. Chapter 292, Just Cause. Gunnalug looked just like the last time Sunny had seen him, like a golden demon born of some harrowing hell. The bright lord was tall and had broad, powerful shoulders. His body was clad in a strange armor that seemed to be made out of molten gold. It was both solid and liquid, flowing over his mighty muscles and covering him from head to toe. Not even Gunnalug's eyes were exposed. In the place where his face should have been, there was nothing but a smooth and empty expanse of polished gold. The great hall of the bright castle reflected in it, and all the people gathered there did, too. As soon as Sunny saw the golden mask, he felt the oppressive aura that radiated from the bright lord. Even knowing what was going to happen, he couldn't help but shake a little and bite his lip. The mind assault of the golden armor was truly hard to endure. Even with the protection of the puppeteer's shroud, he felt it pressing on him, making it hard to breathe. Deep inside, a primal, bestial fear was clawing at his heart. But this fear did not belong to him. It was fake. With a dark grimace, Sunny strangled it and made it disappear. Walking out of the darkness of the alcove like a golden apparition, Gunnalug glanced at the mass of people below him and sat on the throne. His pose was relaxed and casual, as though he was here to leisurely resolve a trivial matter, not decide someone's fate. Hundreds of fates, perhaps. However, despite his laid-back attitude, everyone gathered in the great hall swayed a little, pressed down to the ground by the incredible force of his presence. The bright lord lingered for a few moments and then said, his serpentine voice full of mirth, "Ah, what a sight! All my precious wards gathered here united in the desire to see justice prevail. This dedication, this fervor for the rule of law. Oh, it just makes my blood boil with appreciation. Don't you think it's wonderful?" He laughed and turned his head slightly, peering directly at Nephice. She lowered her head a bit, an almost imperceptible tremor running through her body. To Sunny, though, it seemed as though the plates of marble beneath her feet were about to crack from the terrifying pressure of Gunnalug's gaze. Nevertheless, she endured it without showing much of the tremendous strain she was under. The bright lord paused and then echoed his words, a note of some dark emotion finding its way into his voice. "Don't you think it's wonderful, changing star of the immortal flame clan?" Nephice gritted her teeth, struggling to remain steady under the psychic onslaught of the golden armor. When she finally answered, her voice sounded suppressed. "Indeed." Gunnalug remained silent for a bit. Although his face was hidden behind the golden mask, Sunny had a feeling that he was smiling. Finally, he spoke. "How nice. Somehow, I was under the impression that you would disagree. I've been told by my most loyal aides that you are a disagreeable person. I guess you just can't trust anyone these days." With that, he glanced at his lieutenants, making them pale and shiver. Sunny shivered too. The message hidden in those words was clear. Gunlog was letting Nephice know that he had known that she had a spy among the highest ranks of his people all along, and didn't care. Maybe even silently allowed it to happen. Damnation. How much did he know? Finally, the Bright Lord looked at Effie. After a few seconds had passed in tense silence, he spoke to her with a hint of sadness. "We meet again, Effie. What a shame that it is in these tragic circumstances. If only you had listened to me and joined the host, perhaps then you might not have fallen so low. Such pity." He shook his head and sighed. "I had high hopes for you. But, alas, murdering innocent humans is not something that can be forgiven. Look at yourself. Instead of a noble hunter, you have turned into a wild beast. But that is what happens when people refuse my grace. They become no better than nightmare creatures." His somber words echoed in the silence of the great hall, making people lower their gazes. Effie trembled, pressed down by the force of his undivided attention. But then, she grinned and answered, her raspy voice sounding relaxed and carefree. She only said 2 words. "Fuck off." Gunlog laughed and raised his hands in a helpless gesture. "I rest my case. You all see how unrepentant this vile murderer is. There's not a drop of remorse left in her corrupted, rotten soul. That is why, with a heavy heart, I have to sentence this once promising young woman to death. She has to answer for her crimes, and leaving her alive would put you, my wards, in danger. I am left with no choice." A hum of voices rose from the crowd. Slum dweller or an inhabitant of the castle, everyone was affected by his last words. "Don't you dare, bastard. Kill that murderer. Effie, we're here. Make her pay. Lady Nephice, you can't let them. Kill her. Kill all of them." Unaffected by this outburst of boiling emotions, Nephice put a hand on Effie's shoulder and looked at the Bright Lord with a cold expression. Staring directly at the golden mask, she frowned and said, her voice clear and loud, "I object." The storm of voices suddenly grew quiet. Everyone turned to her, 2 kinds of expectation hiding in their eyes. One was full of hope. The other was full of vicious glee. Gunlog tilted his head. "Object? What do you mean?" "Her guilt has been proven without any room left for doubt. There is nothing you can do to change the outcome." He paused for a moment and then suddenly leaned forward, his insidious voice washing over the great hall like a wave. "Well, unless, of course." Changing Star looked at him with dark resolve and lowered her chin stubbornly. "Then," she said, "I want to invoke the right of challenge." Chapter 293 The Challenge. An echoing silence fell on the great hall of the ancient castle. The fateful words had been spoken, and now there was no turning back, for better or for worse. Gunlog tilted his head and stayed quiet for a few moments. Then, the sound of his laughter rolled over the crowd. "The right of challenge? Oh, that old thing. You are awfully fond of that tradition, it seems. Not even a full year since you have arrived under my roof, and I had the pleasure of hearing you say those words twice. Insolent girl." He paused for a few moments and then leaned forward. His voice suddenly turned cold, full of dark undertones. "To be honest, I am very tired of your insolence, Changing Star." Before Nephice could answer, the Bright Lord suddenly rose from his throne, towering above the crowd like a statue cast from pure gold. Then, he took a leisurely step forward and began descending the stairs of the dais. With each step, the sound of his serpentine voice resounded, growing lower and lower, until it turned into a fiendish, wrathful growl. "Your little games were fun at first, but the more I observed your clumsy attempts at playing the hero, the more disgusted I became. I couldn't believe how naive, self-righteous, and stupid you turned out to be. It made me sick. It made me want to do things that I promised myself to never do again. I expected better from the daughter of the immortal flame. To disappoint me so thoroughly." His growl reverberated through the great hall and then abruptly disappeared. A moment later, Gunlog suddenly threw his head back and laughed brightly. "Oh, but then it hit me. I was such a fool. You fooled me so beautifully. Brilliantly done, Changing Star. Please accept my compliment. After I saw the real you, it was such a joy to watch your performances. He left the stairs and stepped on the marble floor of the throne room. The crowd of the castle inhabitants parted in front of him, people hurrying to get as far away from the oppressive aura of the golden armor as they could. The bright lord sighed. It's such a shame that all of this will have to stop now. You see, while I can't help but applaud your effort in the end, you still turned out to be just another fool. He glanced at Effie and asked, his voice full of mockery. A challenge? I don't think it's your place to demand such a thing. You are not the one accused of the crime, after all. If someone has to invoke the right of challenge, it should be Effie herself. Don't you think? Nephice gritted her teeth, struggling to remain poised under the assault of the psychic pressure. Refusing to turn away from the polished mirror of the bright lord's face, she said. It's just like one of your minions said. I am responsible for the actions of my people. Any crime they commit is my crime. Gunlog watched her, his expression hidden. Neff's pale face was reflected in his mask, staring back at her with merciless gray eyes. After a while, he spoke. Sound logic. Who are you going to challenge, then? She hesitated for a few moments, then said steadily. Whoever it was that passed the guilty verdict. The bright lord chuckled. Oh, but by the same logic, that would be me. She smiled darkly and glared at him, white flames dancing in her eyes. Then you are the one I challenge. Her words resounded in the great hall, sending hundreds of people gathered there into a state of stunned shock. So, this is it. Sunny looked at the crowd of stunned people, mentally separating them into two groups. Those who were going to be a threat, and those who were not. Regardless of how the fight between Nephice and Gunlog ended, the small enclave of humans living in the Dark City was going to descend into utter chaos. If Changing Star was killed, her followers would make her into a martyr and go insane. The host would not just let them off, either. If the Bright Lord fell, no matter how much of a bastard Gunlog was, he was also the glue that held this whole place together. Without a tyrant enforcing some semblance of order, no matter how ghoulish, things would get really ugly really fast. Who was going to stop the nightmare creatures from wiping the humans out then? In any case, there was going to be a bloodbath. But he was done worrying about these matters. In the upcoming mayhem, Sunny's goals were very simple. Remain alive. Protect Nephice. Make sure that she becomes the new tyrant of the Dark City, so that she could carve the way back to reality for a few lucky survivors. If she doesn't die right here and now, of course. In the silence that enveloped the great hall, the bright lord laughed and tilted his head, staring at Changing Star from behind his golden mask. Then he said, "How audacious. I wonder what gives you the confidence to dare challenge me. Various people have tried to kill me, you know. I have a little hobby actually collecting their skulls. Come to think of it, your pretty head would look really well in my collection." Suddenly, he raised a hand and gestured to his forehead. Don't tell me that it's all because of that little toy that you took off the First Lord's corpse? Oh no. That would be terrible. You didn't really think that one powerful memory would be enough to defeat me? Nephice lingered for a while, glaring at Gunlog. Then she said evenly, "My bare hands would be enough to defeat a worm like you. The memory is just to make it quicker." Gunlog stared at her for a moment and then chuckled. Great. This is great. Such spirit. I will really enjoy breaking you, Changing Star, when this done. He flexed his shoulders and said, his voice sending shivers into the hearts of hundreds of people gathered in the hall. All right. I accept your challenge. Chapter 294 Song of Steel. The great hall of the bright castle grew silent and still. However, that stillness was not tranquil, but like a predator that fell low to the ground, ready to explode into a violent lunge to tear its prey apart. The sleepers pressed themselves against the walls, giving Changing Star and the Bright Lord space for their battle. Effie was dragged away from the middle of the hall by two guards, and now there was nothing but emptiness separating the two fighters. From one side of the hall, the 5 lieutenants, Gemma, Tezsai, Kido, Saishin, and Haruz, were looking at their master with complicated emotions. On the other side of it, Kai, Castor, and the leaders of the outer settlement hunting parties were doing the same. Cassie was also there, her hand resting on the hilt of the quiet dancer. There was a grim, somber expression on her beautiful face. Sunny glanced at the blind girl and then turned to the center of the throne room. Two people were standing opposite each other there. One was a tall man encased in a strange golden carapace that followed the lines of his mighty body. The other was a young woman in an elegant plate armor forged of white metal. There was a subtle similarity between them. Both were emanating a striking, compelling sense of power and confidence that very few people ever possessed. Both were fearsome and deadly. Both were at the apex of their kind. However, this was where the similarity ended. This doesn't look good, Sunny thought, evaluating the two fighters. He knew better than anyone what Nephice was capable of, but even then, the sight of her facing Gunlog made a deep scowl appear on her face. The Bright Lord was much taller than her and weighed probably twice as much as the Changing Star. He was stronger, had longer reach, and had much more experience in slaughtering people. That was not even considering that damned golden armor of his. Even with the miraculous augmentation of the Dawn Shard, Neff's silver sword could barely be considered at the same power level as an ascended weapon would have been. That was still a whole rank below Gunlog's strange echo. Trying to break through that armor was going to be as hard as cracking the shell of a carapace centurion with a sword forged from mundane steel. Incredibly hard, if not impossible. And unlike the carapace of a scavenger, the golden echo did not seem to have a weak spot. At that moment, sparks of light appeared in the air in front of Changing Star. The silver longsword appeared in her hand, and she pointed it to the ground for now. What weapon is that bastard going to use? That would decide a lot. Sunny was sure that Gunlog possessed an arsenal of powerful memory weapons, but how powerful were they exactly? He glanced at the Bright Lord, expecting to see the same sparks swirling around his hands. However, there was none. Instead, the liquid gold flowed forward and assumed the shape of a heavy battle axe, which Gunlog then grasped and leisurely put on his shoulder. The polished mirror of his mask reflected the slight frown that appeared on Neff's face. Damn it. The weapon the Bright Lord was going to use was also a part of his echo, and as such, possessed the quality of a transcended weapon. It was going to cut through the Starlight Legion armor without much effort. This is even worse than I imagined. As Sunny gritted his teeth, Gunlog said in a serpentine, insidious voice. Any last words, Changing Star? Nephice tilted her head a little and remained silent for a while. Her helmet weaved itself from strings of light, hiding her face completely, with only calm gray eyes visible through the crack of the visor. Finally, she answered with only one word, her usually even voice full of furious contempt. Traitor. A wave of whispers spread through the crowd. People were guessing what exactly she meant by that, but Sunny suspected that he was the only one who knew. Neff wasn't accusing Gunlog of betraying his fellow humans or causing the deaths of numerous young men and women. She was accusing him of betraying the true duty of the Awakened and submitting to the nightmare spell instead of fighting it to the bitter end. In her mind, that was a far greater crime. The only crime, even. The Bright Lord laughed. That's too bad. I heard that one before. And then, without wasting even a fraction of a second, he suddenly exploded forward in a terrifying, lightning-fast lunge. The shift between peace and violence was so instant and swift that most people gathered in the Great Hall did not even realize what was happening until a few moments later. With each of Gunlog's strides, the floor of the throne room shook a little. He flew at Nephice like a furious giant made of gold, swinging his battle axe with both incredible agility and horrible force. She barely reacted in time, shifting her body and raising the sword to deflect the killing blow to the side. However, then something unexpected happened. The shaft of the battle axe suddenly elongated, the liquid gold comprising it flowing forward to assume a new shape. As a result, her deflection ended up being almost useless. With an awkward stagger, Changing Star reeled back. The very edge of the battle axe's blade bit into the helmet of the Starlight Legion armor and effortlessly cleaved through it, leaving a shallow cut on her cheek. In the next moment, Gunlog's foot crashed into her ribs, sending the young woman flying through the air. Nephi's landed in a roll and used one hand to stop herself from sliding on the marble floor. As drops of blood fell from beneath her helmet, merciless white flames ignited in her eyes. A moment later, she jumped forward and met the onslaught of the Bright Lord with an equal amount of fury. The deadly song of clashing steel resounded in the ancient hall, like a promise of much greater bloodshed yet to come. Chapter 295 The Duel. The breastplate of Neph's armor cracked from the force of Gunlog's blow, and there was blood streaming from beneath her helmet, but that didn't slow Changing Star one bit. Jumping forward to meet the Bright Lord's assault, she dodged the blade of the battle axe, twisted, and tried to deliver a strike of her own. A furious clangor of metal exploded in the silence of the great hall, both fighters moving with incredible speed, precision, and skill. In a span of several seconds, they exchanged numerous blows, but each was either deflected, dodged, or blocked. This terrifying clash was not at all like Sunny had imagined. There was nothing elegant, graceful, or elevated about it. All there was barbarous violence and cruel brutality, each of the fighters doing everything in their power to break, cripple, and kill their opponent. Their voices sounded like that of wild beasts, partially from the incredible strain of the duel, but also to let out the suffocating bloodlust and murderous intent that were drowning their minds. That was not to say that any one of them had lost control of their thoughts and actions. Both were cold-blooded killers and knew how to remain calm in the throes of the most terrible rage. A few seconds later, Gunlog and Nephis disengaged and staggered away from each other, letting the spectators draw in shaky breaths. The Bright Lord's golden armor was pristine and unscathed. Nephis, however, had several bloody cuts on her body, the black material encompassing it torn and ripped. Another crack appeared on one of her pauldrons. She glanced at it briefly and then indifferently turned back to watch her enemy. Everyone in the throne room, in one way or another, was thinking about the same thing, a cold and sickening feeling slowly spreading through their chests. How would they fare in such a fight themselves? The answer was simple. They would have been long dead, eviscerated in mere seconds by one of these awesome fighters. Everyone felt death breathing down their necks. Among all the people watching their fight, however, there were two who observed Changing Star's every move with a special kind of attention. They were Sunny and Castor. Their reasons for studying how Nephis fought were entirely different but also almost the same. Just a second of rest, and the two fighters lunged at each other once again. This time, however, their behavior was different. The first clash was just a test to gauge what the enemy was capable of. Now, they were not holding anything back, throwing everything they had at the enemy. At least that was how it seemed. Changing Star's sword suddenly flashed with brilliant radiance. Removing one hand from the hilt, she grasped the incandescent blade with her armored gauntlet at the middle to better control its tip and raised it to shoulder level. With Gunlog's ability to change the length of his weapon at will and almost impregnable armor, this grip was more advantageous. The Bright Lord absorbed the battle axe back into his armor. Then, two straight blades grew out of his forearms, creating weapons that resembled long, heavy punching daggers. They clashed once again, this time with even more fury. The people pressing themselves into the walls of the throne room trembled. Nephis seemed to abandon a lot of her defense, willing to take much bigger risks to obliterate the enemy. The reach of her sword was much shorter now, but the silver blade also grew much more agile and unpredictable. Gunlog's daggers were a true menace to resist, however. They flew at her from all sides, either in tandem or in a staggered rhythm, making it hard for the young woman to predict and deflect each blow. But she wasn't trying to. Changing Star seemed willing to receive many shallow wounds to get a chance to land a strike on her opponent. More bloody lacerations appeared on her body, the Starlight Legion armor barely holding together. But she achieved her goal, in the end. Catching one of Gunlog's daggers between the blade of her sword and her body, she forcefully twisted the sword sideways and caused him to turn his torso. Then, Nephis sidestepped and suddenly appeared behind the Bright Lord, with a fraction of a second left before he could turn around and defend himself. Her incandescent sword finished its arc high above her head, and, changing back to the standard grip, she brought it down with all her strength on Gunlog's shoulder. The radiant white blade flashed through the air and bit into the golden armor. And then, it slid fruitlessly off its bright surface, not leaving even a scratch on it. Damn it all! In the next moment, Gunlog threw the sword to the side with one arm and delivered a terrifying blow with the other, his dagger aimed at Neff's face. She managed to turn her head at the last moment, avoiding instant death, but was still caught by the enemy's fist. The impact was so strong that Changing Star was thrown backward several meters. The helmet had shattered completely, revealing a pale, bloodied face with bits of metal piercing the skin. She rolled several times and came to a stop, then rose to her feet with some effort. The white flames dimmed a little, and there was a dark, disoriented emotion in her eyes. The gem of the Dawn Shard shone gently right above them, illuminating Neff's wounded face. A moment later, she dismissed what little remained of the helmet and stared at Gunlog with resentment, blood running from the cuts on her cheeks. The Bright Lord laughed and made a step toward Changing Star, his voice echoing under the roof of the great hall like a death sentence.
What?
That was all. Nephis did not answer. Instead, she placed both hands on the blade of her sword, holding it with its hilt and crossguard up, like a makeshift mace. The radiance of the silver sword spread to encompass all of it. But it didn't stop there. Sunny opened his eyes wide. What? The furious white flames spread from the sword to Changing Star's hands and her arms, and then devoured her figure completely. But they weren't burning in the white, cracked metal of the Starlight Legion armor. Instead, the brilliant radiance was emanating from her skin. Chapter 296 Creature of Light. Sunny stared at the shining figure in front of him, a myriad of thoughts appearing in his mind. With her skin emanating blinding white radiance, Nephis looked beautiful and pure, as though untouched by the imperfections of the mundane world. Wreathed in light, she was like a heavenly angel that descended into the mortal realm. The sight of it was both breathtaking and terrifying. It was also eerily similar to the image of the radiant creature he had seen on the walls of the ancient mine, especially with the gem of the Dawn Shard burning on Neff's forehead like a third eye. But that wasn't what gave Sunny pause. How is possible? But then, why wouldn't it be possible? At the start of their journey, he had guessed that Changing Star's aspect was of the divine rank, just like his. Her powers seemed to be able to either augment memories or heal, while his own could be used to scout, enhance memories, or augment Sunny himself. Because Nephis had never used the white flames to achieve that last effect, he had assumed that she was incapable of doing so, and thus her aspect, while powerful, was less versatile. But augmenting herself was exactly what Neff was doing right now. Sunny knew it instantly. She wrapped her body in light just like he had wrapped his own body in the shadow countless times. With this enhancement, her physical prowess had to grow exponentially. Had she always been capable of doing so and hid that facet of her aspect intentionally? Or was this something she learned how to do only after growing more powerful and absorbing hundreds upon hundreds of soul shards in the labyrinth? That question was going to remain unanswered, at least for now, because the battle between Changing Star and the Bright Lord was far from over. Just like Sunny suspected, with her body wreathed in light, Nephis suddenly became much stronger and faster. If before she was visibly weaker and slower than Gunlog, even if not by much, now, it seemed the other way around. She dashed toward the enemy, batted away one of the daggers, and delivered a crushing blow right to the polished mirror mask. This time, there was a slight mark left on the surface of the golden armor by her sword. The two of them became locked in a ferocious battle, dozens of attacks flying at each fighter. The clangor of metal grew in volume, turning into an almost deafening cacophony. Changing Star was fighting with abandon, more and more wounds accumulating on her radiant body. However, she also managed to land several more blows, each striking at the golden mirror of the Bright Lord's face. Slowly, a hint of a crack started to appear on its surface. Sunny also noticed that her wounds weren't healing. It seemed as if Nephis was only capable of supporting two effects at the same time, one augmenting her sword, the other her body. To summon the healing power of the white flame, she had to sacrifice one or the other. but she was unwilling to. A few moments later, it seemed as though Gunlog was slowly starting to lose ground. His enemy was just too fast, powerful, and ferocious. More and more strikes landed on the golden armor, and although it seemed to hold, for now, it was clear that the continuous blows were taking a toll on both the Bright Lord and his echo. However, the Golden Serpent had a few tricks up his sleeve, too. When the momentum of the fight began to favor Nephi's, he suddenly chuckled and turned his face to catch her reflection in the mirror mask. A second later, the sound of muffled groans could be heard escaping from the mouths of hundreds of people. The psychic pressure emanated by the Bright Lord suddenly increased manyfold, throwing some people to the ground and making others stagger. Sunny saw blood flowing from people's noses, eyes, and mouths. He himself also felt it and gritted his teeth, struggling to remain standing. He almost failed. Changing Star, who was at the center and the true target of the mental assault, let out a pained yelp and staggered. That was the moment when Gunlog stepped forward and stabbed her through the chest with one of his daggers. As the long blade pierced the lithe body of the young woman and exited from her back, he said in a calm and friendly voice, There, that's enough. Go die now, stupid girl." Then, he twisted the dagger, making her scream once again. Nephi stared at him, blood flowing from her mouth. Then, she raised her sword and hit him in the face with the pommel, again and again, until a small crack finally appeared on the surface of the mirror mask. But the crushing wave of mental pressure did not go away. Instead, it only increased. Gunalug laughed. "Are you done? No? Well, let me help you then." His second daughter flashed through the air, slashing Nephi's across the wrist. With the tendons cut, the silver sword fell from her hand, its radiance dimming. Nephi's used her other hand to push the Bright Lord away and slid off the blade of the dagger, then staggered away, eventually falling to her knees. The white radiance emanated from her body grew brighter, and the wound on her body began to heal. A low groan escaped from her lips. Gunalug approached the kneeling young woman, laughing. "Did you think I would know about that little trick of yours? Go ahead and heal. See where it gets you." With that, he grabbed her by the neck and stabbed her again, reopening the terrible wound that had just closed once again. "How's that? Come on. Heal it again." With a ferocious growl, he continued stabbing her, over and over, his hand quickly becoming painted red with blood. "Oh, this is really fun, but a bit tiring. How about I just cut off your pretty head right now and end this?" Nephi spat some blood and turned her head to face him, and then she closed her eyes. Back when they had first arrived in the Dark City, Sunny had noticed that Cassie wasn't affected by the psychic pressure of the golden armor at all. From that, he deduced that the source of the mental assault was not the armor itself, but the golden mirror of its face. Or, to be exact, seeing your reflection in it. After returning from the castle, he had shared that insight with Nephi's. It seemed that she remembered it. With her eyes closed, Changing Star raised her hands and grabbed the Bright Lord who was strangling her by the shoulders. Then, she used her whole body to deliver a devastating blow to his face, the gem of the crown of dawn hitting Gunalug right where his nose should have been. Finally, the surface of the golden mirror cracked and shattered. Through the small bria, a blue eye full of murderous joy was revealed. Shocked by the sudden blow, Gunlog staggered away. "You bitch." The daggers were instantly absorbed into the golden armor, replaced by the heavy battle axe again. But he didn't get the chance to use it. With her eyes still closed, Nephi swiftly turned to the sound of his voice. Then, she raised her hand, opened her fist and blew on it. In the next moment, a cloud of red sand shot from her palm and enveloped Gunlog. Sunny stared at it in shock, an expression of sudden recognition appearing on his face. He knew the look at that cloud all too well. It wasn't sand. It was the blood flower pollen. Chapter 297 Red Flower. The red cloud enveloped Gunlog, seeping through the crack in his helmet. A second too late to react, the Bright Lord reeled away, but not before inhaling the pollen of the nightmarish flower. Sunny didn't know when and how Nephi had gotten it, But he knew that he wasn't mistaken. This was the pollen of the blood flower, the grisly parasitic blossom that he himself had the misfortune of inhaling once a long time ago. The memory of the bloodthirsty red flowers growing through his lungs sent shivers through Sunny's entire body. Back then, the only reason for why he had not become a host for the insidious nightmare creature was because of the blood weave. Without it, he would have been devoured from the inside in mere minutes. And now, the Bright Lord was going to fall to the same fate. She really did it. The rest of the sleepers gathered in the Great Hall did not know that Gunlog was already as good as dead, however, including the tyrant himself. Bending over in a fit of violent coughing, he growled, What have you done to me, bitch? Nephice was still where he had dropped her, kneeling on the floor. Her armor was shattered and torn, with rivers of blood streaming down the cracked white metal. The brilliant radiance of her skin had been extinguished, but there were incandescent flames burning under it. The horrible wounds on her chest were slowly closing, and the lacerations on her face were already gone, leaving it just as perfect as it had been before. That face, however, was bloodied and pale, contorted in an expression of terrible agony. In her eyes, however, there was dark malice. A chorus of whispers rolled through the crowd when they witnessed the ghastly wounds healing themselves. Be it the members of the host or the slum dwellers, all of them had two words on their lips. Immortal flame. Immortal flame. And then someone shouted, their voice full of stunned awe. This is the blessing of the fire. Deaf to all of it, Changing Star moaned and slowly rose to her feet. Then, she struggled to look at the Bright Lord and said, her voice shaking from pain, I killed you. Through the crack in the golden mask, Sunny saw Gunlog's blue eye first narrow and then suddenly open wide. In the next moment, the Bright Lord began coughing again. This time, a suppressed scream escaped from his lips. It's about to start. Sunny shifted a little, subtly positioning himself closer to Castor. Gunlog, meanwhile, staggered and groaned. There was blood dripping from beneath his broken mask. Then, a shaky laugh resounded in the throne room of the ancient castle. Ah, did you really? What a surprise. He dropped his battle axe, which then turned into a puddle of liquid gold and merged with his strange armor. He took a step toward Nephice, but then swayed and fell to one knee. For a few moments, the Bright Lord remained motionless. Then, his body convulsed, more blood spilling through the cracks in the visor of his golden helmet. A muffled scream could be heard once again, full of torturous pain. Hundreds of people were watching him, stunned, their eyes full of disbelief, anger, and terror. The Bright Lord raised his head and glanced at Nephice, then hissed, What a joke! I can't die like this. Changing Star looked down on him, her face cold and motionless. There was no triumph or gloating in her eyes, but there was also no mercy. Turning away, she hesitated for a moment and then said, her voice strangely gentle, Rest easy now. Your nightmare is over. Gunlog stared at her in disbelief, and then suddenly laughed. There was a disturbing, gurgling sound coming from somewhere deep in his throat, as though he was drowning in blood. Good, this is too good. Yours is only starting, though. With that, he slowly rose and then turned away. Swaying, the Bright Lord took one step forward, then another. The crowd watched silently as he arduously made his way to the steps that led to the throne of white marble and climbed them, blood spilling from the cracks in his helmet, his golden armor flowing and swirling around his body in a state that resembled panic. Finally, Gunlog reached the dais and fell on his throne, looking down on the great hall of the ancient castle with a strange, wistful expression. Then, he strained to say something, but became twisted in a violent coughing fit instead. In the end, he just whispered a few almost inaudible words and leaned on the back of the throne, his body relaxing. Sunny was perhaps the only one who had heard him, due to the fact that his shadow was hiding in the darkness of the alcove all along. I tried. In the beginning, I really did. This was what Gunlog had whispered. And then he grew still. The Bright Lord of the Dark City was dead. Sunny knew it instantly because of the fact that the terrible psychic aura pressing him to the ground suddenly disappeared, letting all the people around him move and breathe freely. Knowing what was about to come, he glanced at the far end of the great hall one last time. A corpse in golden armor was sitting on the throne, a beautiful red blossom appearing from the crack in his polished mask. A few moments later, the armor suddenly shined with white light and then disintegrated into countless sparks, revealing the man who had ruled this cursed place for many years with an iron fist. Gunlog was surprisingly handsome. Even though his face was covered in blood, it was easy to tell. He had a short beard and long blonde hair. One of his eyes was gone, eaten through by the blood flower, and the other was quickly turning glassy. What surprised Sunny the most, though, was how young he looked. It was hard to imagine the Bright Lord as anything but powerful and ageless, but in fact, he was no older than 27. Somehow, Sunny had forgotten that fact. Kids. All of us here are just lost kids. He didn't waste too much time thinking about that, though. In the next few moments, Tessai, who had been staring at his dead lord with his usual morose expression, turned around and looked at the crowd of slum dwellers, then at the members of the host. The giant lingered for a second and then said, his deep, dark voice reverberating through the ancient hall, "What are you waiting for? Kill them all." And then, everything descended into madness. Chapter 298: Fire and Blood. The first guard to follow Tessai's order lunged forward, summoning his weapon, and fell to the ground, a heavy kunai suddenly appearing in his eye. Due to everyone's attention being drawn to the bloodied figure on the throne, no one noticed as Sunny moved his hand slightly, letting the prowling thorn fly. He wasn't looking at Gunlog, though. His eyes were drawn to Nephice, while his shadow watched Castor. When the Bright Lord died, something strange happened to Changing Star. Her eyes opened wide, losing focus, and then she swayed a little and fell to one knee. Her body was busy rearranging itself after absorbing a huge amount of soul essence, which made Nephice vulnerable for a few moments. That was when Tessai had given his order, and that was when Sunny threw his kunai and killed the guard rushing to attack the slum dwellers. Someone screamed, and in the next moment, the great hall of the castle descended into chaos. Unnoticed by anyone, Castor suddenly turned into a blur. Not so fast. Sunny was thrown off his feet and awkwardly fell, his wrists screaming in pain. He had achieved his goal, though. Even while falling, he saw the proud legacy rolling on the marble floor, tripped by the invisible string of the prowling thorn. A second later, hundreds of sleepers clashed against each other, their suppressed rage, bloodlust, and murderous resentment finally exploding into a storm of violence. The white marble was instantly painted red with blood. The guards slaughtered indiscriminately, their powerful memory armaments and training giving them a vast advantage over the disorganized crowd of slum dwellers. But they weren't killing just those who came from the outer settlement. In the panic and havoc that engulfed the throne room, differentiating friend from foe was not an easy task. Sunny saw several artisan assistants fall to their blades, as well as a few unlucky people who had paid a heavy tribute in exchange for the promise of safety. With Gunlog gone, that safety was now gone, too. It almost seemed as though the guards didn't care who they killed, or were even glad to be let off the chain. Even if there were those among them who had preserved some vestiges of conscience, now, it was utterly gone, devoured by the crowd instinct and the exhilaration of being free from all restraints. Their faces were contorted with ferocious grimaces, and their eyes burned with rage, hatred, and tenebrous joy. This was perhaps the most disturbing and frightening thing that Sunny had ever seen, and he had seen some of the most chilling horrors the dream realm had to offer. How can humans do this to other humans? But that question was moot, and also hypocritical. Humans were indeed the most adaptable of creatures. When they needed to, they were easily able to devoid their victims of the status of a human being, thus absolving themselves of any guilt or sin. Why feel guilty for slaughtering cattle? Creatures worse than cattle, even. Hateful pests. Sunny had practiced that simple mind trick himself in the past. These thoughts only took him a fraction of a second. Jumping to his feet, Sunny summoned the Midnight Shard and dashed toward Nephice. The slum dwellers, meanwhile, came to their senses and met the assault of the host with as much fury and bloodlust. Even though they were less experienced, well-fed, and armed, their resolve and exalted fury made up for that. Protect Lady Nephice. Kill the bastards. Judgment. The two forces clashed, eviscerating anyone who had the misfortune of being stuck between them. Screams of terror and pain filled the great hall. The floor turned slippery with blood, and dead bodies piled on it, staring into emptiness with wide eyes. Sunny saw the scarred hunter from before diving under the strike of a young guard and drive the tip of his sword into the enemy's throat. He saw several hunters of the host lunge at Effie, who had easily tore the rope that bound her arms and met them with a ferocious grin, the beautiful bronze spear weaving itself from sparks of light in her hands. He saw Tezsai crushing a random sleeper's skull with a heavy mace. The poor youth was only guilty of getting in his way. He saw people screaming in fear as they tried to flee the hall. Many fell on the floor and were then crushed under the feet of the panicking crowd. The problem was he didn't see Castor. Arriving near Nephice, Sunny batted someone's sword away and then punched his opponent in the face, causing him to fly back with a pained scream. He looked around, trying to notice the proud legacy, his mind cold and collected, and there he saw him. Castor may have had plans to kill Changing Star at the moment of her weakness, but thanks to Sunny's subtle intervention, he lost that chance. Now, the legacy had bigger problems on his plate. With the enchanted gem in his hand, he was fighting none other than Gemma, the leader of the hunters. No matter how strong and skilled Castor was, this was not an opponent that would go down easily, if at all. He couldn't extricate himself from that fight without risking being killed. Well, that problem seems to be solved. But now there was another, much bigger one. Back at the steps leading up to the white throne, Haruz was standing with his back turned to the slaughter below, a strangely disoriented expression frozen on his face. Sunny could see his face because the shadow never left the darkness of the alcove, watching the dreadful hunchback's every move. Haruz was staring at Gunlog's dead body, his glassy eyes confused and empty. But then, slowly, a hint of a dark and deadly emotion appeared in them. Turning around, he studied the great hall, not disturbed even a little by the bloody chaos, the clangor of steel, and the scores of people dying in front of him. And then his gaze fell on Nephice. Crap. At that moment, both Kai and Cassie appeared by Sunny's side. Turning to them, he gestured to Changing Star and yelled, "Protect her." At the dais, Haruz tilted his head, piercing Changing Star with a murderous gaze. Slowly, his face contorted, turning bestial and terrifying. Pure hatred and insanity burned in his eyes, making anyone who accidentally glanced in his direction shudder. With a low growl, the hunchback took a step forward and outstretched his hand, ready to summon a weapon. But in the next moment, someone crashed into him at full speed. Even though Haruz had dodged the flying blade at the last moment, the force of the impact was such that both men flew back into the darkness behind the throne. Breaking through a wooden hatch that was hidden there, Sunny and Haruz rolled down a long flight of stone stairs and left the havoc of the great hall behind. A few moments later, they landed on the floor of a wide corridor and were thrown away from each other. Sunny twisted his body to regain his balance and used the midnight shard to stop himself from sliding even farther away. Then, he rose to his feet and looked darkly at Haruz, who was similarly just standing up. A cold glint appeared in his eyes. Just like Sunny had expected, today, one of them was going to die. Chapter 299 Twisted Reflection. Out in the great hall of the ancient castle, the air was full of screams and clangor of steel, with rivers of blood being spilled on the white marble floor. But in the wide corridor, Sunny and Haruz had found themselves in, the havoc that reigned above seemed muffled and distant. It was just the two of them here. Picking up the midnight shard from the cold stones, Sunny flexed his shoulders and looked at the hunchback. There was a dark, icy fire burning deep within his eyes. How wonderful! We are finally alone. The hunchback tilted his head and stared at him with his glassy eyes, not saying anything. A slight smile appeared on Sunny's lips. What? No reaction. Well, Fair enough. Allow me to introduce myself, then. My name is Sunny, and I've been craving to kill you for a long, long time. Haru's remained motionless, looking at him with the same indifferent, bored expression. A hint of anger appeared on Sunny's face. Taking a subtle step sideways and slightly turning his torso, he said in a casual tone, "To tell you the truth, Harus, I have killed many monsters. Some of them were nightmare creatures and some were men. I killed a person or two as well. But I have never done it out of malice. I've never enjoyed it too much." He paused and then spat, his voice shaking. "But I will enjoy killing you." Sunny grasped the hilt of the midnight shard with both hands and took a step forward, piercing the hunchback with a furious gaze. "You embody everything that I despise. The mere fact of your existence offends me. You sicken me, and for that reason alone, I am going to end you. You don't deserve to live." Harus blinked and continued staring at him, motionless. Sunny stopped a few meters away and snarled, frustrated at the lack of response. "Do you have any idea what I had to do, what I had to sacrifice, how many things I had to let go of to save myself from becoming someone's slave? And here you are, living as one of your own free will, bastard. What gives you the right? Who gave you the idea that you can breathe the same air as I do?" The hunchback finally showed a sign that he had heard Sunny. With a slightly irritated expression, he shook his head and said, "Dalk, dalk, dalk. You talk too much, little worm." Sunny grinned. A dangerous spark appeared in his eyes. "Yeah? Well, what are you going to do about it?" Harus smiled, too. His smile was cold, unnatural, and frightening. "Break you apart. You will have to die anyway. All of you will." Sunny raised his eyebrows. "Oh, really? Why is that?" The hunchback shrugged and outstretched his hand. Weaved from the sparks of light, a heavy chain appeared from the air, wrapped around his arm from wrist to elbow. Then, he grimaced and straightened his back as much as his deformity allowed him. Before, he seemed to be of the same height as Sunny. But now, Harus towered above him almost as much as Tessai had, his twisted figure radiating a sense of vicious, bestial power. As two menacing lights ignited in his pale eyes, he growled, "Because this is the will of the Lord." Sunny laughed. "Lord? The bright Lord? I don't want to disappoint you, fool, but your Lord is dead." Harus stared at him with sincere confusion. Then, a corner of his lips curled upward. With something that almost resembled pity, he said, "Poor worm. You don't even understand what loyalty means, do you? Alive or dead, it doesn't matter." Sunny snarled, "You're right. I don't understand." Finally, he raised his sword and prepared to attack. "You know, I spent so much time trying to learn what your aspect ability and flaw are. But now I am glad that I don't know. I don't want to kill you using a trick. I just want to obliterate you." Harus listened to him. A mocking grin appeared on his lips. And then, Sunny suddenly became blind. A moment before, Sunny was looking at the hateful figure of the fearsome hunchback. Then, suddenly, his sight was gone, replaced by nothing except for boundless darkness. Almost immediately, a monstrous blow sent him flying back. Sunny hit the wall of the corridor and then fell to the floor, leaving a trail of blood on the cold stones. His bones groaned, but held together if barely. Harris, who had hit him in the chest with a fist, the heavy chain wrapped around his knuckles, lunged forward with terrible speed, aiming to crush the enemy's skull under his boot. His movements were swift and utterly silent. To his surprise, though, the little wretch somehow managed to roll away and jump back, avoiding death by a hair's breadth. Sunny slid backward and rose to his feet, blindly swinging the midnight shard in a wide arc in front of him. The blade of the Tachi missed the murderous hunchback entirely, but bought him a second to gather himself. Not that it was going to help. He was still blind. Of course that all makes sense now. Sunny finally unraveled the mystery surrounding Harus. He understood why so many sleepers, no matter how skilled, and with no regard to the might of their aspect abilities, had been somehow rendered powerless and easily slaughtered by Gunnalug's executioner. He also understood why there were no witnesses to the countless murders that Harus had committed. No one had ever seen him killing his victims. Their bodies were always found only after the slaughter was over. It was not because the terrifying hunchback was able to move like a ghost or possess such great power that no one could even try to resist it. It was because his aspect ability could literally make people not see him, or anything for that matter. It didn't matter how skilled or mighty his opponents were. Once they were blind, all their technique and abilities were made useless. Killing a blind person was an easy task. It also did not matter if someone was there to see Haru's kill. As long as he wanted, he would remain unseen for as long as he wished. That's how the legend of the horrifying butcher was born. People were always more afraid of things that they couldn't see, after all. Sunny spat a mouthful of blood and grimaced. It was nice to reveal another secret. The question was, would he be able to survive knowing the truth? Chapter 300 Bright Lord Slave. By a twist of fate, today, Haru's was facing possibly the worst opponent he could have faced on the Forgotten Shore, among the sleepers at least. However, Sunny wasn't surprised. He had always felt that he and the murderous hunchback were destined to end up fighting each other to the bitter end. Before, he had thought that this was just intuition, but now he knew that his occasional and subtle premonitions were anything but random. All that time ago, he had already sensed that the two of them were connected by a string of fate. Was it such a surprise, then, that his aspect happened to counter that of Haru's to a large extent? And it did counter it, although not completely. If anyone else was in Sunny's place, they would have been already dead. Robbed of their sight, very few people, if anyone at all, could have resisted the furious assault of the terrifyingly strong hunchback. But Sunny wasn't just anyone. Even while blind, he had shadow sense on his side. While it wasn't the same as being able to see Haru's, by sensing the movements of his shadow, Sunny was able to predict his attacks with at least some level of precision. It wasn't perfect, though. At least he had not reached the level where this form of perception could fully replace vision. So now, Sunny had a choice to make. While his shadow was wrapped around his body, it gave him an incredible boost in strength, speed, and endurance. It wasn't able to provide him with a second pair of eyes, however. So he could either continue to rely solely on shadow sense and keep this boost, or let the shadow go and fight Haru's with just his own strength while being able to see. Decisions. Sensing the hunched shadow of the murderous butcher lunge forward, Sunny dodged left and heard something whistle past his temple with terrible speed. A fraction of a second later, and his skull would have been crushed by the links of the iron chain wrapped around his enemy's fist. He missed the hunchback's other hand, though. His wrist was suddenly caught in an iron grip and twisted, forcing Sunny to yelp and let go of the midnight shard. Another second, and his bones were going to shatter. Following the direction of the twist, Sunny performed an aerial cartwheel to save his arm and reluctantly ordered the shadow to slip off his body. As he landed on the stones, Sunny was finally able to see again. Haru's was holding him by the wrist with one hand, his other raising to deliver a crushing blow. Sunny doubted that there would be anything left of his face if he were to allow that blow to land. He still held the midnight shard in his free hand. Turning the tachi upward, Sunny thrust it in the direction of the hunchback's throat. As a hint of surprise appeared in his enemy's eyes, Haru's changed the direction of his strike, turning it into a block instead. The razor-sharp blade bit into the links of the heavy chain wrapped tightly around his forearm and bounced off. However, that gave Sunny the opportunity to wrestle his wrist free and jump back. Despite the fact that his bruised hand was shaking, he put it back on the hilt of the midnight shard and faced Haru's once again. The hunchback tilted his head and stared at Sunny with an amused expression. "Slippery worm, how are you doing that?" Sunny grinned. "Wouldn't you like to know?" Then, he grimaced and added after a few moments of pained silence, "I can still see you thanks to my aspect."
Harus grinned.
"Oh, good, it is nice of you to tell me." With that, he suddenly threw his hand forward. What is he doing? The distance between them was too large to land a punch. But in the next moment, Sunny realized his mistake. It was too late, however. The chain suddenly flew off the hunchback arm and instantly covered the distance between them. Before Sunny could react, it was tightly wrapped around the blade of the midnight shard. Then, Haru's pulled it back with tremendous force. Sunny could either allow himself to be thrown to the floor right in front of the cruel executioner or let go of his sword. He chose the second option. The midnight shard flew far away and fell on the marble floor with a melodious ringing. There was little hope of retrieving it, and Sunny doubted that Haru's was going to give him enough time to dismiss and summon the Tachi again. Indeed, almost instantly, the fearsome hunchback was already lunging at him, the iron hammers of his fists ready to break every bone in Sunny's body. "Go die, bastard," Sunny growled and dashed forward. Dodging a deadly strike, he twisted his body and delivered a ferocious blow of his own. His fist connected to the hunchback's chin, making Haru's reel back. Sunny might have been lean and not as tall as most men, but he wasn't a weak outskirt kid anymore. The power of 900 shadow fragments, each earned in a deadly fight against unimaginable horrors, coursed through his veins. He was much stronger than he looked, strong enough to shatter stones with his bare hands. And yet, he wasn't nearly as strong as Haru's. While shaken by the blow to the face, the hunchback didn't look seriously hurt. But his next strike almost made Sunny buckle. For a few short moments, the two of them became entwined in violent, barbarous combat. Using their fists, legs, and even teeth, they did anything in their power to destroy the enemy. Haru's fought with the measured skill of an experienced killer, while Sunny fought with the desperate, feral cunning that his cruel upbringing had taught him. The hunchback was at a dire advantage in that fight. With his tremendous might and much larger weight and reach, all he had to do to win it was to wrestle Sunny to the ground. Knowing that, Sunny had done everything in his power to avoid being grappled. He twisted and moved, dodging the hunchback's large hands and delivering strike after strike. Soon, Haru's was bleeding from a half-dozen cuts on his angular face. Sunny, however, was in much worse shape. The hunchback's fists, and especially that damned chain of his, had left terrible marks on his body. The skin on his forehead was split open, and a stream of blood was flowing down his face. Usually, that would have blinded a person. But both of his eyes were already blind. He was using his shadow to see. How ironic. Still, it was just a matter of time before Sunny made a mistake. And very soon he did. Sunny was only a fraction of a second late, but it was all Haru's needed to land one of his wide palms on his shoulder. Then, he gripped it with enough strength to make Sunny's bones groan, thus robbing the enemy of his only advantage, mobility. As Sunny's eyes opened wide, the hunchback grinned. "Time to die, little worm." With that, he threw him against the wall, making a net of cracks streak through its stone surface. Hurt and disoriented, Sunny felt something cold and inevitably grip his neck. Looking his victim right in the eyes, Haru squeezed Sunny's neck and smiled. "Good. It's good that you can see. Usually they don't. Such a pity." Sunny raised his fist and hit the hunchback in the face, but to no result. He couldn't find the proper purchase or move his torso to deliver a proper blow. Regardless, he tried again, then again, then again. The skin on the face of his strangler split, letting more blood flow, but Haru's just continued smiling, looking at him with fascination. "Good, good. This is so good, so good." Sunny weakly raised his hand again, but lingered, hesitating before trying to hit the hunchback again. With what little air remained in his lungs, he wheezed. "Hey, bastard, do you remember how I told you that I didn't want to use a trick to kill you?" Haru simply grinned. Well, that was a trick. At the same time, he struck the hunchback in the face again. Knowing that these punches were not strong enough to change anything, Haru's didn't react. But this time, a ghostly blade suddenly appeared in Sunny's hand at the last moment. Unlike normal memories, this one weaved itself from nothing, and almost instantaneously. Then, it pierced Haru's temple and sunk deep into his brain, killing him on the spot. The grin froze on the hunchback's lips. His eyes widened, then slowly turned glassy. His terrible grip on Sunny's throat weakened. Then, he crumpled to the ground like a broken mannequin, his empty eyes still open and staring into nothingness. Sunny fell to his knees and drew a hoarse breath. "Die, you bastard." D. A wicked, furious grin appeared on his face. Die and go keep your lord company in hell." Shaking, he used the wall to stand up and looked at the dead butcher with a strange mix of hatred, triumph, and contempt. After a while, he said, "Don't want it doesn't mean I won't, you fool." Chapter 301 Heirs to the Throne. As Sunny sat on the cold stones, wiping blood off his face and wincing from pain, the whole castle shook slightly, and dust fell from the ceiling of the wide corridor. Looking up, he frowned slightly, then turned to Haru's and indifferently cut a strip of cloth from the hunchback's garments. The corpse didn't mind. Tying the cloth around his head to stop the blood from streaming into his eyes, Sunny sighed and summoned the runes. Shadow Fragments, 956/1000. Such an injustice. His battle with Haru's was one of the toughest he had experienced on the Forgotten Shore, but all he got from it was one measly shadow fragment. This was one of the lamentable quirks of the shadow slave aspect. It didn't differentiate between humans and nightmare creatures at all. From its point of view, Haru's was nothing but a dormant beast. Or maybe it was a blessing in disguise. Killing humans is a really unlucrative business, Sunny said with regret, and glanced in the direction of the throne room, where the terrible battle still raged on. Several hundred humans driven insane by fury and bloodlust could create a lot of destruction in a very short amount of time. Several hundred powerful sleepers, each in possession of an aspect ability, were so much worse. Add the echoes in the mix, and Sunny shuddered to imagine what was going on back in the Great Hall right now. The number of lives being extinguished every second up there must have been immense. The members of the host, the followers of Changing Star, and everyone unlucky enough to exist on the Forgotten Shore today were dying by the score. Blood was flowing like a river in the halls of the Bright Castle, just like Cassie had predicted all those months ago. Just like Sunny had feared it would. What was Nephi's thinking? Her ambition had never been to become the ruler of the Dark City. Wresting the control over the ancient castle from Gunlog had always been just a means to an end. Her true goal had always been in the Crimson Spire, where the terror of the Forgotten Shore dwelt. From that point of view, this massacre was such a waste. Of potential soldiers, of countless memories, of every other potential resource she was going to need to reach the gateway. But then, was it really? After all, the rest of humanity was not bound by the strangeness of the divine aspect Sunny possessed. When one awakened killed another, they received a vast portion of the soul essence their enemy had accumulated. A lot of it simply disappeared, but what remained was more than enough. The Crimson Spire was not a place one could conquer with cannon fodder. So really, Nephis did not need 1,000 weak humans. What she really needed was a few hundred powerful, battle-tested fighters. What was happening in the Bright Castle right now was not a waste. It was consolidation. Sunny sighed and rose to his feet, summoning the midnight shard from the darkness of his soul. It was time to rejoin the battle. In the end, almost 200 people perished on that day. Despite all that death, the battle ended in a bitter draw. And the main reason for this was only 3 people: Nephis, Tezsai, and Gemma. No matter how powerful and skilled the rest of the sleepers participating in the battle were, no one stood a chance in a fight against either one of these 3. Not even Castor, who by then many had believed to be one of the strongest fighters in all of Dark City due to his incredible skill, powerful aspect, and noble background. When the proud legacy clashed against the leader of the hunters, his enchanted Jian quickly found its way into Gemma's heart. However, to everyone's horror, the tall man did not even blink after receiving the mortal wound. And just a few short moments later, it magically closed, not leaving even a scar behind. No matter how many times Castor had cut or pierced the body of the fearsome hunter, Gemma's flesh simply restored itself. It was as though the proud legacy was cutting water. Gemma's aspect ability made him nearly immortal, while his incredible skill, cunning, and might made him a herald of death. Tezsai was equally as formidable. His powerful aspect ability was tied to cold and ice. It allowed him to both make his skin hard as stone and debilitate his enemies, turning their movements slow and stiff. What was worse, it countered Nef's flames to a large degree. Eventually, when the death toll became too large, all 3 gave their followers a command to retreat. By the end of the day, the new lord of the Bright Castle was still not decided. The castle itself became divided between three warring factions, led by the three contenders to the throne. The largest and strongest faction, one with the most fighters and most memories to arm them, was formed by the alliance between Tezsai and the leader of handmaidens, Saishin. Together, the guards and the handmaidens became a force that the other two factions could not challenge openly. They held the northern and western parts of the castle, where most of the strategic and easily defendable areas of it were situated. The second faction was led by Gemma and Kido, the chief artisan. While the two of them had fewer fighters than both other factions, each of these fighters was worth a dozen. They were the hunters, the most experienced and formidable sleepers in all of the Dark City. Although the territory this faction held was not large, it was of utmost importance, since they controlled the only reliable source of food and water in the Bright Castle. The last faction belonged to Nephice alone. She controlled the southern part of the castle, where its main gate was situated, as well as the outer settlement, to where many of the previous inhabitants of the ancient citadel had fled in the hope of finding shelter. However, they quickly realized that there was no more safety anywhere in the Dark City. With Gunlog gone, all orders disappeared. No one went on hunts to bring back food, no one manned the walls to drive the nightmare creatures away, and no one was there to stop the crime and violence that blossomed in the darkness of anarchy. And things weren't going to change until a new lord usurped the White Throne. The bloody struggle for the crown had begun. Chapter 302 Status Quo. In the next couple of weeks, the Bright Castle had become a strange place. Inside its magnificent halls, barricades were built and three makeshift fortresses appeared, each faction holding a specific territory. Beyond these protected areas, there was no man's land. Going outside of a faction's stronghold was often tantamount to death. No one knew what they would encounter there. Corpses littered the floor, with an occasional marauder hiding in the darkness. With no more law, tyrannical as it had been, many people gave in to their darkest impulses. But these wretches were the least of the dangers that now populated the castle. A much worse fate was to stumble onto a patrol or a war party of another faction. The guards especially were quick to slaughter anyone they met, sometimes in gruesome and inventive ways. The hunters and the followers of Changing Star were equally as ruthless, but at least not without reason or provocation. But the most terrifying change was that now, humans weren't the only ones populating the ancient citadel anymore. After Gunlog's death, too many people were killed, and the rest were too busy with their little war to keep defending the castle. And just like that, after so many years, the nightmare creatures had returned under its roof. Some were killed by the representatives of the factions, but some managed to hide themselves and create nests somewhere in the depths of the stronghold. No one knew how many there were, but the terror kept people awake at night. There were also a lot of rumors going around, one more frightening than the other. The most persistent of them told of a horrible creature called Bloodlord, which apparently stalked the corridors of the Bright Castle and killed humans, tearing their throats open with sharp fangs and consuming all of their blood. Some even thought that it was Gunlug himself, who returned from the grave to bring vengeance to his killers. Sunny was doubtful of these rumors up until the moment when he found the bloodless corpse of a young guard on one of his patrols. For a moment, he felt fear creep into his heart. He knew what the blood flowers were after all. But then he calmed himself down, remembering that the Bright Lord's body had been destroyed during the massacre that followed his death. If the corpse of Gunlog wasn't walking around drinking people's blood, though, then what was? There were a lot of disturbing things happening in the castle these days. Apart from the frequent but minor skirmishes between the factions, people kept dying in all manner of morbid ways. He didn't even want to think about it. There was no safe place anywhere now, except for maybe the three strongholds. The outer settlement had been completely abandoned. At first, Nephice had tried to create a safe haven there for those who did not wish to participate in the war, but she was quickly taught a bloody lesson by her enemies. Spreading her forces too thin was simply an invitation for an attack. After that, all of her followers, willing or unwilling, had relocated to the southern part of the castle and joined the ranks of her fighting force. And yet, even 2 weeks later, Nothing had changed. The three factions continued their bloody struggle, unable to break the status quo. Soon, something had to change. One evening, Sunny was sitting on a crate in one of the halls of Changing Star's stronghold. In his hand was a bowl with a measly ration, which he nevertheless was eating with a lot of enthusiasm. A few meters away from him, a couple of Neff's followers were doing the same while having conversation. Out of boredom, he listened to their voices as he ate. Have you heard? They found another dead guard near the throne room. The Blood Lord got him. Good riddance. That thing really creeps me out, though.
Yeah, scary.
But do you know what I'm really afraid of? The slum dweller looked at his partner, who had been paying a tribute to living in the castle just a few weeks ago, and raised an eyebrow.
What?
Haruz. That creepy bastard. Where is he now? Damn, if I were able to dream, I would be having nightmares about that butcher every night.
Wait.
You didn't hear? What? He's dead. The tributary opened his eyes wide, while Sunny turned away and tried to suppress a smile. No way.
Yeah.
They found his body after the big battle in a hidden passage behind the throne. Someone had beaten him to death. With bare fists. That's what I heard. For a few seconds, there was silence. Then, one of them said, "What kind of human could kill that monster? With bare hands?" The slum dweller shivered. That's the thing. No one knows. All of the powerhouses were accounted for. You saw it yourself. They were all fighting in the throne room. Crap. Now I am even more scared. Haruz was dreadful enough, but to think that there's a person in this castle who is powerful enough to kill him so easily while remaining completely unnoticed and unknown for all this time, damn, that's terrifying. The slum dweller gave him a nod and turned to Sunny. Hey.
Sunny, right?
You're Lady Nephi Scout? Who do you think could kill Haruz? Sunny thought for a moment and then said, honestly, well, apart from yours truly, who is a true terror on the battlefield and possibly one of the deadliest sleepers to ever exist in the world, I think Cassie could. The young man stared at him with disapproval and then shook his head. Not cool, man. Boasting is fine, I guess, but mocking Lady Cassia was really low of you. Sunny blinked. When did he mock Cassie? Considering the aspect ability that Haruz possessed, she was really the next best person to fight the hunchback after Sunny himself. She was already blind and adapted to fighting in that state as best as she could. With the help of her echoes, Cassie stood a good chance of surviving that battle. With an apologetic smile, he shrugged and said, Sorry, I just chose my words badly. In any case, I'm off. With that, he jumped off the crate and headed toward the barricade that served as the border of the faction's stronghold. The slum dweller raised his eyebrows. Where are you going? The night is approaching. Sunny grinned. Hunting for a big one. Don't worry. I lived in the Dark City for 3 months, remember? Nothing is going to happen to me today. Chapter 303 Helpful Shadow. The slum dweller pressed his finger against his lips and hissed in exasperation. Take that back. Are you crazy? Sunny blinked.
What? No.
Well, I was crazy for a while, but now I am not. The young man looked at him with doubt and shook his head. Still, don't jinx yourself. Do you at least have a memory to keep you safe? The question of arming themselves was a big problem for Neff's followers. More than half of them didn't have a memory armor or a weapon, having to make do with mundane armaments fashioned out of anything that was at hand. It was one of the reasons why fighting against the guards and the hunters was so hard for them. The other guy, the one who used to pay tribute, sighed and called out to his friend. Have you lost your mind? You're talking to a member of Lady Nephi's personal cohort. Of course, he has memories. With that, both of them looked down on their own makeshift swords. These two were among those who wielded black claws, blades made out of the talons of the spire messenger Sunny, and the rest had killed. Their bases were wrapped with leather, allowing a person to use the long curved talon as a weapon. Considering that these talons came from a fallen monster, as far as weapons went, they were some of the best. Wielding them efficiently was not an easy task, though. The slum dweller grimaced.
Right. Damn.
I am proud to wield one of the black claws, don't get me wrong. But if each of us had a proper set of memories, those bastards wouldn't be picking us off one by one anymore, that's for sure. Sunny looked at him with a complicated expression. Then he smiled. A good memory can change a lot, that's true. As soon as he turned around, the smile disappeared from his face. It's not going to save your lives, though. All of you are just walking corpses. With that, he left the two sleepers behind, climbed over the barricade, and left. Nevertheless, they were right. The lack of memories was a big problem. Sunny walked through the shadows, moving deeper and deeper into the belly of the ancient citadel. The bright castle was enormous in size and had countless twisting corridors. Some were comparatively easy to navigate, while some followed no apparent logic. There were tall towers connected by aerial bridges and deep dungeons full of darkness and danger. There were humans with murder in their hearts prowling these corridors, as well as much more terrifying things. Disturbing sounds sometimes echoed through the stone halls, making Sunny stop and frown. A couple of times, he decided to hide to avoid being noticed by the patrols of the guards or the hunters. Following in their wake, he stumbled on a few fresh bodies and regretted not killing those bastards when he had the chance. Half an hour later, Sunny was somewhere under the main keep of the castle, moving through a dark corridor with careful steps. It was then that he heard the sounds of a struggle coming from beyond the next turn. Ugh, what a bother. Hesitating for a bit, he made the turn and witnessed a scene that was typical in the ancient citadel these days. One human was trying to kill another. In this case, it was a burly guard that seemed vaguely familiar. The large man was pressing someone small and skinny to the wall, strangling them with gauntlet hands. A broken oil lantern was burning on the floor, making the shadows of the two struggling people seem large and menacing. The guard's face had 4 deep scratches on it, which were oozing blood. It was contorted in an expression of rage and dark delight. The face of his victim, meanwhile, was slowly turning blue. It was a petite young woman with dark hair and brown eyes, which were currently full of pain and despair. Just a few moments before she lost consciousness, though, a hand appeared from the darkness and slid a strange, transparent dagger across the guard's throat. Hot blood shot into the air, and he fell to the ground with a horrified, gurgling sound. The young woman staggered and drew in a hoarse breath, rubbing her bruised neck. A few moments later, she looked up and cautiously studied her savior. It was a very pale, slender young man with a youthful face and dark, strangely magnetic eyes. Currently, he was wiping his dagger on the sleeve of his armor and staring at the dying guard with an indifferent expression. In fact, he was disturbingly nonchalant, not at all like someone who had just killed another human being. There was neither disgust and fear nor delight and triumph on his face, just nothing at all. It was the face of a cold-blooded killer. Turning to her, the young man smiled. You're Aiko, right?" Sunny looked the young woman over, making sure that she wasn't seriously wounded. He knew her a bit from his days in the castle. Back then, she had been one of the few people who were able to pay tribute without worrying about making enough shards to do so the next week. She owned the only gambling den in the Dark City, which automatically made her establishment popular among the members of the host. But it was also the reason why many of them harbored resentment toward the tiny girl. Aiko cautiously nodded. Usually, there were mischievous sparks in her eyes, but right now, there was nothing but subdued fear. Sunny dismissed the moonlight shard and said in a friendly tone, "Nice to meet you. I'm Sunny." The young woman stared at him for a bit and then said, "You're one of Changing Star's men, right?" He grimaced. "I'm no one's man. I'm completely my own. But yes, currently Nephice is my employer, I guess." Aiko hesitated and said in a polite and pleasant voice, "I see well, Sunny. Thank you for saving my skin. I'll be going then." Sunny grinned. "Oh, I'm sorry, did I say that you can go?" "I think not. In fact, I must insist that you stay." Aiko glanced at the corpse of the guard, then back at the pale young man. Did she imagine it, or were there slight hints of madness in his eyes now? Why didn't you say so? If you want me to stay, then I will definitely stay. It will be my pleasure, really. But, Sunny, why exactly did you want me to stay?" He scratched the back of his head and answered after a bit of a pause. Oh, I'm glad that you asked. You see, I am trying to hunt down a big one. And I thought that you would be able to help. Chapter 304 Hunting for a Big One. Sunny stared at Aiko, secretly delighted that he didn't have to look up for a change. The young woman's eyes darted into the depths of the corridor, clearly evaluating how good her chances of running away were. They weren't. In the end, she sighed and turned to Sunny with a deep frown. For some reason, such a serious expression looked a bit comical on her petite face. Sunny, was it? Listen, buddy, boss. I am really thankful to you for helping me out, but honestly, do I look like a hunter? How am I supposed to help you hunt? Maybe go ask one of your strong, manly friends. Then, her eyes widened. You're not planning on using me as bait, are you? Sunny chuckled.
No.
Nothing like that. It's just that for this particular hunt, you are the only one who can help. By the way, I didn't just stumble on you by chance. I was watching you for a long time, actually. She paled a little.
I see.
Well, to each their own, I guess. But still, I am no warrior. I really think that I won't be able to help you out this time, sadly. Sunny shook his head. Relax, Aiko. You see, the big one I'm hunting is a friend of yours. Big, fat bastard named Stev. He's the one I'm after. And I know for a fact that you know where he is hiding, because you're the one hiding him. So, an expression of utter surprise appeared on Aiko's face. With sincere confusion, she asked, Wait, what? Stev? The memory market guy? Why the spell would I know where he is? She blinked a couple of times, then said in a hesitant tone, Are you sure you're not confusing me with someone, Sunny? He sighed and lingered for a few moments, then rolled his eyes. All right. I don't really want to waste time here, so we'll do it the quick way. Look there. He pointed to a shadow. Aiko lowered her eyes, which then widened when the shadow suddenly turned its head and waved to her. What the? Sunny crossed his arms and said, This here is my shadow. It's an invaluable helper. Among other things, it can walk around on its own and report back to me the things it saw. Guess what it saw yesterday? Aiko paled, staring at the shadow with wide eyes. The shadow stared back at her, full of disdain. So, let's not pretend that you don't know where Stev is. Just take me to him. The young woman glanced at him and gritted her teeth. Then, she asked with dark resolve in her eyes. What do you want from him? Sunny raised his eyebrows. What do I want? That guy is walking around with 100 memories in his soul core.
Guess.
Aiko clenched her tiny fists. He's my friend. I'm not going to. Sunny waved her hand and interrupted her. Oh, don't be so dramatic. I'm not going to do anything bad to him. If I wanted to, I would have killed you already. My shadow saw where you were going already, remember? In fact, Sunny was bluffing. While he was almost sure that Aiko was hiding Stev because of how much food she was stealing every couple of days, too much for such a tiny girl to eat on her own, he had no idea where her hideout was. That was because it was situated somewhere past the guard's territory, and Sunny had avoided sending his shadow anywhere near where Saishin was. A stunned expression appeared on her face. After a while, Aiko asked, You really are not going to hurt us? Sunny offered her his most friendly, honest smile. For some reason, the petite girl shuddered. I am not, you can trust me. I am the most honest man in the world, after all. 2 worlds, even. A few hours later, 3 figures were sneaking through the corridors of the bright castle. One was a pale young man in dark leather armor, the second was a petite girl with mischievous eyes, and the third was a giant of a man with a vast round belly. Because of him, all their attempts to be stealthy were rendered practically useless. Nearing another corner, Sunny sighed and gave the other 2 a signal to stop. The guards are patrolling ahead. We'll have to wait for a bit. Stev and Aiko glanced at each other and shrugged. Because of their difference in size, the 2 looked nothing short of comical together. Shaking his head, Sunny summoned the endless spring and took a few sips of water, then offered the beautiful glass bottle to them. Why were you hiding from everyone anyway, Stev? The ample giant looked at him with a sullen expression, then said in a depressed tone, Why else? As soon as this mess started, I knew that people would be coming for me to get the memories. Sunny frowned. The memory market belonged to the host, so why didn't you just go to either Tezsai or Gemma? Stev grimaced. I know Tezsai too well to go anywhere near him with Lord Gunlog gone. As for Gemma, we're on friendly terms, actually. But that girl, Keto, let's just say that I called her a few names in the past. Over a business dispute, one might say. Who knew she'd go and become one of the lieutenants? Anyway, I was afraid for my safety because she and Gemma are, Sunny raised an eyebrow, then asked in a curious tone. Then what about Nephice? Aiko gave him a complicated look. We heard that her people don't treat us castle folk well. And Stev was even officially under the host, so we sort of had nowhere to go. Sunny frowned. There was indeed a measure of internal strife in Nef's faction, with some outer settlement people being against anyone from the castle joining them. Changing Star and the members of her cohort tried to prevent anything too nasty from happening, but they couldn't be everywhere at once. There are a few troublemakers, true. But you'll be fine. Just say that you're with me. He thought for a couple of moments, and then corrected himself. Actually, don't say that. Most of them barely know who I am. Say that you're with Knight. And if Knight asks why are you going around telling people that you're with him, then tell him that you're with me. The two of them suddenly looked at him. My buddy Kai is alive? That's wonderful news. Stev said with a wide smile. On Aiko's face, a dreamy expression appeared. Why haven't you told me that you knew Knight from the start? That would have made things so much easier. Sunny stared at them and shook his head. Pick up your drool, will you? Why had he even spent a whole hour trying to convince Stev to return with him? He could have just taken Kai with him, and the damn bastard would just say yes after one smile from the beautiful archer. So unfair. Then he suddenly turned his head and froze. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. The guards who were supposed to walk past his shadow a whole minute ago never appeared. Chapter 305 Trail of Blood. Raising his hand, Sunny gave Aiko and Stev a signal to remain quiet. Then, with a frown, he commanded the shadow to abandon its hiding spot and find the guards. They can't be near us. I would have heard them. Then where did the bastards go? Soon he had his answer. The three guards were in the corridor 100 or so steps from Sunny's current position, just behind a corner. In a place where they shouldn't have been, since it was way off their previous route. They were also dead. Two had their skulls smashed in. Sunny did not know what weapon, tool, or limb was used to kill them, because their memory armor had already disappeared. It had to have been something capable of piercing through steel, though, because the guards had been wearing helmets the last time he saw them. The third was even worse. His throat was torn, seemingly with terribly sharp fangs, to such a degree that the young man's head was almost separated from his body. One would expect a sea of blood to come out of such a terrible wound, but in fact, there was surprisingly little of it on the floor. However, the corpse of the guard was unnaturally pale, as if devoid of blood completely. Curses! Sunny felt a cold shiver run through his body. The shadow cautiously looked around, but didn't notice anyone else present on the scene of the gruesome slaughter. Aiko and Stev were staring at Sunny with alarmed expressions. After waiting for several minutes, he finally relaxed a little and motioned for them to follow. What happened? He hesitated for a few seconds, then said in an even tone, "The Blood Lord has just been here." Their eyes widened. That fiend? Then why aren't we running? Sunny glanced at them with a calm expression. Don't worry, it's already gone. Inside, however, he was anything but calm. A creature capable of killing 3 guards was not necessarily something he would be scared of. One that managed to get past his shadow and slaughter them just 100 steps away without making enough noise to attract his attention. That, on the other hand, was a reason for concern. Just what kind of an abomination is it? Sadly, the 3 of them had to pass the place where the guards had been killed to reach their destination. Soon, the smell of blood hit their nostrils, making Aiko and Stev turn pale. The bodies of the guards looked even more gruesome in person. Sunny frowned slightly, while Aiko and Stev had to struggle to keep the contents of their stomachs inside. Gods, poor bastards. Sunny did not say anything, looking around with a dark expression. He was hoping to notice something that his shadow had missed to give him a clue of what type of nightmare creature the Blood Lord was. exactly. But there were no signs that anyone except for the 3 guards had been in this corridor in a long time. Hey, Sunny, can we please leave? This crap doesn't seem to bother you, but I mean, Stev seems to be really scared. Just imagine what is going to happen if he faints and falls. The whole castle will hear, probably. Sunny hesitated for a little, then nodded. Just before they left, however, he suddenly noticed something glinting in the pool of blood. The shadow had not noticed it earlier because there was nothing to shine on the small object and make it reflect the light back. Crouching, he reached out with his hand and picked up the bloodied piece of metal, then brought it close to his eyes to take a closer look. Pressed between his fingers was an intricate silver earring in the shape of a flower blossom. It wasn't a charm memory, though just a simple piece of jewelry. What is that thing doing here? With a confused scowl, he lingered for a few moments and then stood up, turning away from the mangled corpses. Let's get out of here. Soon, they returned to the barricades, creating the border of Changing Stars territory. The sleepers standing watch were surprised to see Sunny come back with 2 strangers, but let them in without asking any questions. Aiko raised an eyebrow. Aren't you guys going to inspect us? What if we're spies? The watchmen glanced at each other, and then one of them said, Usually we would, but it's Sunny. The petite young woman smiled.
Oh.
Is he in very high regard around here? The watchman gave a strange look and then coughed with a bit of embarrassment. It's not that. It's just that starting a conversation with him is, well, you know, a headache. Sunny stared at him with an offended expression. What's that supposed to mean? The watchman hurriedly shook his head.
No.
Nothing. I need to inspect the barricade. If you'll excuse me. With that, he made a hasty retreat. Did I scam him out of his boots or something? Shaking his head in bewilderment, Sunny turned away and led the 2 newcomers deeper into the stronghold, searching for Nephice. She was alone in a spacious room. Changing Star sat on the floor, wrapping herself in her white cloak, and stared at the wall with a distant expression. These days, Neph was a bit strange. She had always been aloof and hard to read, but now, her usually indifferent face had become completely motionless. Her gray eyes had always been calm, but now, they seemed to be especially cold. Almost empty. Sunny had no idea what was going on with her. Maybe she hasn't recovered from using her aspect ability to its full extent, still. Clearing his throat to attract her attention, Sunny gestured to the giant man and the tiny girl he brought. Hey, Neph. I've recruited these guys. She tilted her head a little and didn't say anything. Sunny smiled. You must remember Aiko. She was the one on whose behalf you had challenged that Pathfinder, Andal, and cut his head off. Then, he glanced at Aiko and narrowed his eyes. The petite girl hurriedly said, Oh, yes. Thank you, Lady Changing Star. That guy was a real menace. Nephice slowly nodded and said evenly, You're welcome. Then, she looked at Stev. And you are? A wide grin appeared on Sunny's face.
Oh.
This is Stev. Stev is a very special guy. You see, he has 100 battle-ready memories stored in his soul core. With that, Sunny patted Stev on the shoulder and said, Basically, he's going to solve our weapons problem. Chapter 306 Final Confrontation. With all of Memory Market suddenly falling into the hands of Changing Stars faction, the skirmishes happening in the halls of the Bright Castle became even more frequent and brutal. People kept killing each other, slowly painting the whole citadel red. And yet, it was still not enough for a winner to emerge. Nephice was always on the front lines, leading her people and slaying countless enemies with her silver blade, as if alien to the very concept of mercy. Wherever she appeared, blood flowed like a river. She had even clashed against Tezsai personally, but their fearsome battle ended in a draw. Now that more than 2 weeks had passed after Gunlog's death and the decimation of the previous order, humans were starting to suffer from the lack of food. There were more and more nightmare creatures finding their way into the castle, too. The situation was slowly turning into an irreversible crisis. In fact, it already had. The civil war raged on, reaping human lives one after another. But it was also forging those who remained alive into much more fearsome, powerful, and hardened fighters. And then, suddenly, the status quo was finally decimated, announcing to everyone left alive in the bright castle that the end was drawing close. The new lord was about to take his crown. And it was not going to be the most noble or formidable of the candidates. It was going to be the most vicious. The news arrived in the stronghold of the Changing Stars faction at the darkest hour of the night. The scouts sent into the depths of the castle returned one after another, bringing with them shocking news. The castle guard had secretly launched an all-out assault on the stronghold held jointly by Gemma and Keto. The hunters were defeated, losing many of their numbers in the battle. Left without their protection, almost every artisan had been captured by the guards, while Keto herself had been killed by Tezsai with his own 2 hands. After her death, Gemma and his surviving warriors had to flee. After the scouts made their report, a heavy silence settled over the stronghold. Everyone understood what was going to happen next. The faction formed by the alliance of the guards and the handmaidens had already been the most powerful of the 3. Now that all the artisans were in their hands and most of the castle was under their control, they would be coming for Changing Star and her people next. In that silence, Nephis looked around at the pale faces of her followers and said after a long and poignant pause, "Stay strong. We will prevail." However, for the first time, her words did not seem to convince them. After a long and sleepless night, an unexpected visitor arrived in the stronghold. It was Gemma, the mighty leader of the hunters. The tall man looked very different from how he had before. His laid-back attitude was gone, replaced with dark exhaustion. His face was grim and ashen, and his light armor was torn and covered with blood. He wished to speak with Changing Star. After she arrived in front of him, Gemma offered her the services of his remaining men in the struggle against Tezsai. She tilted her head and asked, her voice emotionless, "What about your ambitions? Didn't you want to become the next lord?" Gemma was silent for a long time, the fire extinguished in his eyes. Finally, he said, "I never wanted to be a lord.
It was Keto's wish.
Now that damn butcher, now that she's dead, I don't care about the throne anymore." He paused, a mournful shadow veiling his eyes. But then, embers of scathing hatred ignited in its depths. Gemma gritted his teeth. "All I care about is to see Tezsai die. If you can promise me that you'll defeat him, I and my hunters will follow you to the end." Nephis was silent for a while, considering his words. Finally, she turned away and answered, "Signal for you men to come. We have some food to share, so eat your fill. Prepare for tomorrow." With that, she walked away. Gemma stared at her back and yelled, "What happens tomorrow?" Changing Star paused for a moment, then answered without turning her head, "Tomorrow, I will kill Tezsai." The next day, there were no scouts and no patrols sent out in the morning. Instead, everyone armed themselves, gathered together, and marched to the throne room. Nephis was walking at the head of her army, clad in the stark black and white armor of the Starlight Legion. On her breastplate, 7 shining stars were engraved. The Great Hall was just as they had left it 3 weeks ago. During that time, members of all 3 factions had gathered the bodies of their dead to give them proper burials, but the white marble floor was still painted red with blood. Tezsai and his people were already waiting for them there. The morose giant was sitting on the throne, looking down from its height. In his hands, there was a terrifying heavy mace, still wet from the slaughter. Sunny grimaced, noticing the difference between the 2 armies. Despite all their losses, there were still almost 100 guards left alive. Not only were they better equipped and trained than the slum dwellers, but now they also had the captured artisans on their side, supplying them with all kinds of tools, gear, and deadly inventions. The artisans themselves were beside them, some of them bound and chained, some simply intimidated into submission. Their faces were pale, frightened, and bloodied. From their position in front of the guards, it seemed as though Tezsai was planning to use these poor people as a meat shield against Changing Star's assault. The handmaidens were also there, standing silently behind the guards. These quiet young women used to maintain the castle and complete various chores around it, but they were capable fighters as well. Since they had not participated in the furious battle that had happened after Gunlog's death, Their numbers did not diminish by much. There were around 100 of them, too. Their leader, Saishin, was also there, at the base of the stairs that led to the throne. Looking at her, Sunny felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He couldn't explain it, but this beautiful and strange woman made him feel fear for some reason. At first glance, Nephis had more people on her side. There were slightly more than 300 of them, comprised mostly of the surviving slum dwellers, with several dozen tributaries and a dozen or so hunters added into the mix. But really, only about a half of them were worth anything in the fight against the battle-hardened guards. Altogether, these were all the humans left alive in the Dark City. Just shy of 600. Everyone else was already dead. And how many more were going to die today? Chapter 307 Throne of Light. Two forces stood against each other, the desecrated expanse of the great hall separating them for now. The tense silence was full of bloodlust and dark apprehension. Sunny slowly made his way to the first row of the crowd, staring at the opposing mass of armored warriors with a complicated expression. From his point of view, followers of Changing Star had little chance of winning this battle. They simply had no advantage against the castle guard, with the exception of the fact that there were more bodies they could throw at the sharp blades of the enemy. Even if everyone here was a mundane human, that would not have helped them prevail against a better armed and trained force. The fact that every single human in the throne room was a sleeper only made things worse. The potential difference in power between the two awakened was much more vast than that between two mundane fighters. And yet, he didn't think that Nephis was going to lose for that same reason. The guards might have been better equipped and more experienced than the slum dwellers, but they didn't have Changing Star on their side. They didn't have Effie, Castor, and Gemma. They didn't have Sunny. They only had two truly fearsome champions, Saishin and Tessai himself. At the end of the day, the outcome of this battle was going to be decided by those few who stood out from the sea of sleepers, impressive as everyone still surviving in the Dark City might have been, like tall and unassailable cliffs. Among the awakened, individual power was so much more important. And in terms of exceptional individuals, the Changing Stars side was far superior. So yes, Sunny felt confident that Nephis was going to win. But at what cost? Out here on the Forgotten Shore, people had nowhere to retreat. So this battle was going to end only after one side was totally annihilated. And the closer to utter annihilation a faction would come, the more desperately its members would fight, like rats driven into a corner. When that happened, the bloodshed would only grow more terrible. Was it only going to stop when just a handful of the strongest and most resilient were left alive? As if reading his thoughts, Tessai suddenly chuckled and looked at the crowd of people gathered in the throne room with a bloodthirsty smile. Is that bastard actually looking forward to the slaughter? The morose giant then looked directly at Nephis and grinned. Changing Star. Ah, we meet again. But wait. Who is that beside you? Is that Gemma, my old friend? What a pleasant surprise. How considerate of you to bring him here. Now I won't have to search the whole castle for that filthy cockroach. With that, he slowly rose from the throne, put his terrifying mace on his shoulder, and descended from the stairs, dark fires igniting in his eyes. Have you come here to die, Changing Star? Nephis tilted her head and looked at Tessai with empty eyes.
No.
I came here to kill you.
The giant laughed.
Stepping on the marble floor, he stopped beside Saishin and bared his teeth in a vicious grin. The two of them looked truly fearsome together. The morose giant was like an incarnation of destruction and violence. His skin had turned slightly blue because of the invisible icy barrier that encased it. The air in the throne room suddenly became colder, with tiny snowflakes dancing in the beams of light. The mysterious leader of the handmaidens was reserved and elegant, but no less frightening. Saishin was exquisitely beautiful, cold, and inexorable. She was wearing a simple, but strangely regal dress, its velvet the color of red wine. There was an intricate silver necklace resting on her chest that accentuated her supple figure and two bracelets on her wrists. Her most striking feature, however, was not her grace and not her beauty, but her skin. It was gray like stormy clouds, smooth like silk, and devoid of any imperfections. Just like Nephis, Seishin was one of those people whose appearance had been changed by their aspect. But in her case, that change was far more pronounced. It gave her an exotic and tantalizing, but outwardly inhuman look. Seishin's beauty was of the kind that put both longing and fear in a person's heart. When Tessai approached, she silently summoned her weapon and stared coldly at the crowd of slum dwellers. Many of them shivered and hurriedly looked away. A few moments later, a graceful war hammer appeared in her hand, one side of its head forged in the shape of a narrow beak. The morose giant laughed. "Kill me? Haven't you tried already? If memory serves, the last time we fought, you ran away like a cowardly dog. What makes you think that today is going to be different, bitch?" Nephis raised her chin slightly and met his mocking gaze with silence.
Tessai shook his head.
"That look. I dreamed about wiping that arrogant look off your pretty face for a long time. Today, I am going to teach you how to beg, girl. So, what do you say? How about we finish this mess once and for all?" The guards standing behind him laughed and readied their weapons, looking at the slum dwellers opposing them with contempt and dark anticipation. Followers of Changing Star gritted their teeth, closing their ranks and preparing to charge. The bloodshed was about to begin. Nephis summoned her silver sword and answered Tessai, her voice cold and indifferent. "Let's." For a moment, time slowed. With a bestial smile, the giant stepped forward. He opened his mouth, ready to give his soldiers the command to attack. A step behind, Seishin silently moved to follow him, and brought the beak of her war hammer on the back of Tessai's head, shattering his skull with one devastating strike. At the same time, the handmaidens who were standing behind the guards attacked the unsuspecting men with long knives that appeared out of their sleeves. These knives were not memories, and as such, did not take any time to weave themselves into reality or shine with ethereal light while doing so. Instead, they were fashioned out of steel, bone, and black obsidian. Just a moment later, the blades plunged into the flesh of the guards, ruthlessly slaughtering them. The handmaidens were aiming for their throats, hearts, and eyes. Blood streamed on the marble floors once again, and screams of terrified agony filled the air. By the time Tessai's soldiers realized what was happening, it was already too late. They had no chance to resist the treacherous attack. A dozen seconds later, everything was over. 100 powerful fighters were mercilessly eviscerated without even having a chance to raise their weapons. Their corpses lay on the floor, a look of horror and disbelief forever frozen on their faces. Only Tessai was still alive. Despite the fact that his skull was broken, the giant was still struggling to stand up, fury contorting the lines of his face. His disoriented attempts, however, were growing weaker with each second. A confused, pained roar escaped from his lips. As hundreds of sleepers stared in shock and horror, Nephis slowly walked across the great hall and stopped near him. Seishin, who was standing behind the giant, gave her a respectful bow. "Lady Changing Star." Sunny stared at her warhammer, which was wet with blood and bone matter, with splinters of bone sticking to its metal surface. An expression of recognition suddenly appeared on his face. The hammer, the mason's hammer, held in Seishin's graceful hand was the sixth shard memory. One that belonged to the walking colossus was the statue of the builder who had created the walls of the Dark City. The sunlight shard. Nephis gave the beautiful woman a court nod. "Good job." Finally, the identity of the spy who had been helping her from within the castle was revealed. Then, she turned to the dying giant and stared at him. Neff's face was still and motionless, with no emotion appearing in her cold gray eyes. After a few moments, she said evenly, "I promise to kill you." With that, she raised her sword and pierced Tessai's heart with one swift, precise strike. The giant man shuddered, and then grew still. Retrieving her sword, Nephis closed her eyes and used it to support her weight for a few moments. A slight tremor ran through her body. The war for the throne was over. The bright castle had finally found its new lady. Chapter 308 Handmaiden. In the aftermath of the castle guard's annihilation, the core members of the cohort gathered in a small room that was situated not far away from the Great Hall. From there, They could hear the bodies of the slain guards being stripped of anything valuable and then dragged away to be disposed of, lest they attract the hordes of hungry nightmare creatures. Just like that, the former most powerful faction of the Bright Castle was no more. Judging by the expressions on everyone's faces, no one had been aware of the secret alliance between Nephice and the Handmaidens, perhaps with the exception of Cassie. But none of them dared to ask Changing Star about it. Well, Sunny had no such problem. Staring at their intrepid leader with a dubious expression, he said, "So, when did you start working with Seishin?" Nephice glanced at him, then shrugged indifferently. "Soon after you left." A slight spark appeared in her eyes.
Why?
"Are you surprised?" Sunny remained silent for a bit, then shook his head. "No, not really. I figured out that your spy was one of the lieutenants a long time ago. I just didn't know which one. But I thought that either your cooperation ended with Gunlog's death, or that they double-crossed you as soon as you got rid of him for them." Changing Star smiled darkly. "She wouldn't." Sunny frowned slightly, then asked, his voice full of cold, calculating curiosity. "So, why didn't she join your faction when all of this had started? Why go to such lengths to create this charade?" But then, he raised his hand to stop her from answering and grimaced. "Actually, don't say anything. I can guess. If the Handmaidens joined us directly, the power of the faction would have been too immense. And that would pressure the other 3 lieutenants into joining forces against it instead of fighting among each other. Then we would have really had to end things with an all-out battle. The last man standing wins. Right?" Nephice glanced at him and nodded. "Correct." Not only did the two of them prevent Tezsai and Gemma from considering an alliance, but they also eviscerated the castle guard without losing a single follower. How diabolical. Even a treacherous cheat like Sunny couldn't help but be impressed. However, there was one problem. His frown returned, now even deeper than before. "If memory serves, the last time we talked about your spy you said that she can never be trusted. You only trusted the information she provided. Why the change of heart? How come you were so confident that she would uphold her end of the deal?" A pleasant, velvety voice suddenly came from behind him. "Maybe I can explain myself." "What the hell?" With a startled expression, Sunny turned around and saw the beautiful woman standing right in front of him. Up close, she was even more striking, with her strange gray skin seemingly shining softly in the sunlight. How did she get so close without alerting either me or my shadow? He didn't like the fact that Seishin had been able to sneak up on him one bit. Things like that were not supposed to happen. The gorgeous woman, meanwhile, gave them a reserved bow and said, "Allow me to introduce myself. Sung Se-sen." Suddenly, Castor's eyes narrowed. A strange expression appeared on his face. Sunny did not miss that sudden change. "Well, the fact that our proud scion is reacting this way can mean only one thing. It's some legacy crap." Sunny stared at Seishin, seeing her in a new light. He studied every detail of her appearance, from the modest cut of her velvet dress to the glinting silver of her intricate necklace. She didn't look like a legacy, at least not the ones he had seen. However, one little detail of her appearance did give him pause. Noticing his gaze, Seishin offered a polite smile.
"Ah."
"No, I am not a true descendant of the great clan Song. However, I have been raised and cared for by the clan leader herself, like many other girls orphaned by the nightmare spell. As such, it is my duty and ardent wish to return to the real world and repay my debt." She lingered for a few seconds, then lowered her eyes. "That is why, while you have no reason to trust in my character, you can at least trust in the fact that my wishes align with yours. I follow Gunlog because only he was able to give people a chance to survive the Forgotten Shore. And I will follow Lady Changing Star because only she can give us a chance to escape it. This is my belief, and this is what I will do. She is Broken Sword's daughter, after all." Without having to discuss anything, everyone stared at Kai, who coughed and said in an embarrassed tone,
Yeah.
"All of this is true. She is very sincere." Effie raised an eyebrow, then turned to Seishin and shrugged. "Well, welcome to the team, then, I guess." One after another, the other members of the cohort repeated her greeting. Sunny was the last to speak. When it was his turn to greet the beautiful handmaiden, however, he remained quiet. Soon, an awkward silence hung in the room. Sunny glanced at the rest of the people gathered there. Nephice, Cassie, Effie, Castor, Kai, Seishan, and him. 7 people in total. A few moments later, he turned to Seishan and stared at her for a bit, then finally said, his voice strangely suppressed, "Welcome." She looked at him with a reserved smile. However, Sunny wasn't done talking. Quickly glancing somewhere left of Seishan's face, he hesitated for a little and then added, "Oh, right. I almost forgot. I found something of yours. I think you dropped it." With that, he raised a hand. On his open palm, an intricate silver earring lay, one side of it covered with blood. Seishan looked at it for a few moments. Then, her lips suddenly parted, her smile turning wide and brilliant. Glancing at him with sparkling eyes, she said, "Thank you very much." "Sunny, right? I thought I lost it." Her teeth were perfectly even, pearly, and spotlessly white. Chapter 309, Where Dreams May Come. In the next week or so, things moved with terrible speed. Nephice became the ruler of the Bright Castle without any type of glorious ceremony or impassioned speech. No one questioned her authority, anyway, as though it was a simple fact of life. In a sense, it was. Sunny found it interesting, however, that she didn't take her seat on the white throne of the ancient citadel once. Even when there was a need for a large gathering, Changing Star sat on the last step of the stairs leading to the throne, as if making a point to show that the Bright Castle did not belong to her, or perhaps that she did not belong to the Bright Castle. At first, he was sure that Nephice was going to push people to march on the Crimson Spire immediately, but she didn't even mention it. When he confronted her about her plans, she simply said that they were going to wait until the winter solstice came before making any decisions. It was just a few days away anyway. In the meantime, everyone who was left alive had a lot to do. There were just 500 people in the Dark City now. In less than a month, the human population of the Forgotten Shore had been reduced by half. The outer settlement remained completely abandoned, but even then, there were barely enough people to maintain and guard the Bright Castle. Nevertheless, they persevered. The halls and corridors of the ancient citadel were cleaned of blood and corpses. The nightmare creatures that had found their way inside were methodically hunted down and eliminated. The breaches in the defensive lines they had created were located and repaired. Neff's watchmen assumed the role of the obliterated castle guard, manning the walls and protecting the stronghold from outside threats. The hunting parties resumed their expeditions into the ruins, with hunters from the outer settlement and the castle joining forces under the leadership of Effie and Gemma. Once again, there was food for everyone to eat and safety to enjoy. Despite the harrowing hollowness and the absence of so many young men and women who had died in the turmoil of the bloody struggle for the throne, not to mention the invisible scars left on the souls of those who had survived, things were slowly starting to resemble how they had been before. But behind this veil of normalcy, they were anything but. And the reason for that was Changing Star and her Crown of Dawn. With the help of the miraculous shard memory, humans of the Dark City were now able to not only hunt more nightmare creatures with less risk, but also challenge fallen rulers of the cursed ruins. Not every one of these terrifying creatures could be killed without paying too terrible a price, of course. But after so many years on the Forgotten Shore, experienced hunters knew a lot about various horrors populating the city. Putting the knowledge together, they determined which ones they could challenge and survive. One after another, many powerful nightmare creatures were tracked down and slain. Suddenly, humans have become, if not the apex species in the Dark City, then at least not the weakest one. By killing fallen abominations, Nephice was achieving several goals simultaneously. She was steadily accumulating an arsenal of memories to arm every person in the castle. Some of those memories were even of the ascended rank, and the number of such powerful armaments slowly grew. She and her warriors also brought back large quantities of soul shards, which were then given to the inhabitants of the castle to absorb and grow stronger. In an ironic twist of fate, it appeared as though now, it was the Bright Lady who was paying tribute to her subjects and not the other way around. This only made the respect and adoration people felt toward her grow stronger. But most importantly, perhaps, was the fact that through these hunts, she was training her people to fight together as a cohesive force and prevail against creatures that were much more powerful than them. Guided by Cassie, the surviving artisans were hard at work, too. They were applying their mastery and craft to close any gaps in how the humans of the Dark City were equipped and supplied for the battle against the Dream Realm. However, the nature of their tasks was drastically different now. If they had been in charge of maintaining the lifestyle of people living in the castle, as much as working to supply Gunlog's host with gear and equipment, now their only job was to create things people were going to need in battle. It was as though they were preparing for war. There were a few large projects that the artisans were working on that Sunny knew little about, too. These things were requested from them by Nephice herself. He suspected that they were going to become useful once the time to attack the Crimson Spire finally came. Just like that, the winter solstice came. On this day, exactly a year ago, Sunny had arrived on the Forgotten Shore. It was hard to believe that he had survived here for so long, that any of them had. But it also seemed as though 1 year was not enough to encompass it all. It felt more like a lifetime. Several lifetimes, perhaps. It was also on this day, a year later, that Sunny turned 18. Remembering his previous birthday, a slight smile appeared on his lips. Back then, Cassie, who had been a complete stranger, offered him unexpected congratulations. He also made plans to celebrate his next birthday as an awakened by drinking a cup of coffee with lots of milk and sugar. Those dreams were not meant to come true. Instead, Sunny met his 18th birthday in an empty hall of the Tower of Dusk, practicing the steps of the shadow dance, sweat streaming down his lithe and strong body. These days, he felt that he was almost there. Just a little bit more, and the first level of mastery over his mysterious aspect legacy would be his. It was already in reach. One more thing happened on that day. As Sunny continued to train, the subtly familiar voice of the spell suddenly whispered into his ear. Your shadow has evolved. Chapter 310 Shadow Demon. Lowering his sword, Sunny stood in the silence of the empty room for a while. In the window, the distant axis of the Crimson Spire loomed, the light of dawn slowly painting it red. A subtle smile appeared on his face.
Ah, thank you, spell.
What a nice birthday present. Summoning the endless spring, he greedily drank delicious cold water and then sat on the floor, crossing his legs and drawing a few deep breaths. Let's take a look. Leaving his worries behind, Sunny dove into the soul sea and walked past the rows of motionless shadows. A long time ago, there had been just a handful of them. Now, hundreds of dark silhouettes watched silently as he approached the tenebrous sun of the Shadow Core. Among them were all kinds of horrors, creatures whose appearance alone would drive weaker men insane. The Mountain King was there. The Black Knight was there, too. The terrifying Spire Messenger stood lifelessly on the tranquil surface of the water. And there were humans, too. Haruz was among them, and so was Harper. Sunny didn't pay them any attention. Standing beneath the Shadow Core, he sighed and summoned the runes. Name: Sunless. True name: Lost from Light. Rank: Dreamer. Shadow Core: Dormant. Shadow Fragments: 977/1000. He was so close to accumulating the whole 1,000. If Sunny really wanted to, he could have abandoned caution and pushed to reach it before the inevitable journey to the Crimson Spire. However, he was wary of delving into anything unknown right before the fateful confrontation. He also felt that his time was better spent consolidating and perfecting everything that he had already learned and earned, not wasting it trying to acquire something new. Still, it was not an easy decision. With a sigh, he continued reading. Memories, Silver Bell, Puppeteer's Shroud, Midnight Shard, Ordinary Rock, Prowling Thorn, Endless Spring, Blood Blossom, Moonlight Shard, Old, Weaver's Mask, Echoes, Shadows. He tilted his head and read, an amused expression appearing on his face. Marble Saint. Marble? How fitting. Without wasting any more time, he summoned his shadow from the depths of the core. She appeared in a whirlwind of black flames, standing in front of him with her usual taciturn aloofness. However, Sunny couldn't help but gasp. The saint was indeed changed. She grew taller and was now even more oppressive. Her graceful stone-like armor, which had looked as though it was cut from granite before, was now entirely black and glossy, like obsidian or onyx. In fact, it was very much like the shattered onyx armor he had purchased with Kai's help. Her skin, on the contrary, became smooth and as white as alabaster, at least the small portion of it he could see through the visor of the helmet. Saint seemed much stronger, aware, deadly. But that was not what made Sunny gasp. The thing that stunned him was what hid beneath the armor. Within the shadow that populated Saint's body, there used to be 2 ethereal dark embers. But now there were 3. Sunny stared at her for a while. Did she rise to a higher class? Finally, he calmed down and made the runes describing the shadow appear. A moment later, his hopes were proved true. Shadow, Marble Saint. Shadow rank, awakened. Shadow class, demon. Demon. She is a shadow demon now. Shadow attributes, battle master, stalwart, spark of divinity. The next line had not been there before. Sunny held his breath. Shadow abilities, weapon sage, underworld armament. He lingered for a moment, trying to suppress a triumphant smile. He had always known that Saint was not a typical nightmare creature. But to think that she would acquire an actual ability before even becoming a devil, and not just 1, but 2. Burning with anticipation, he read on. Weapon Sage ability description. Shadow Saint can effectively wield any weapon type memory. Underworld armament ability description. Shadow Saint's armor can accommodate a charm memory to inherit its enchantments. Sunny was silent for a bit, then turned his head and stared at the taciturn monster. No, not monster.
Demon.
A satisfied smile finally appeared on his face.
Ah.
How wonderful. Not only had his shadow grown tremendously stronger, but she now also had the ability to use any weapon he would provide for her, as well as reinforce her armor with all kinds of powerful enchantments. The possibilities this could provide her were truly endless. The potential combinations, the flexibility, all it took was to find proper memories. Sunny shook his head and grinned. Before, he had sometimes thought that Saint was really suited to command an army. But now, he understood that he had been wrong. She was in the army. A few hours later, the members of Nef's cohort gathered on the roof of the old hunting lodge, which still stood at the edge of the slum. Saishin was also there, which made Sunny slightly uncomfortable. He didn't let it show on his face, however. The outer settlement was desolate and empty. There were no desperate, hungry youths around anymore. All of them were now either safely hidden behind the castle walls or dead. It was just the 7 of them. They came to see Kai off. The charming archer was standing near the edge of the roof, checking his equipment for the last time. He was wearing a new stylish armor and a leather jacket with fur on its collar. On his back, there was a quiver full of arrows and a backpack with water, food, and other supplies necessary for a long journey. Sunny didn't know about the rest, but his heart was heavy. As though reading his thoughts, Kai turned around and smiled. Really, guys, don't worry. I'll be fine. This is not my first time spending some quality time in the labyrinth. No one answered, knowing that the mission entrusted to Nightingale this time was especially dangerous, but also important. He had to leave the Dark City and explore the vastness of the Forgotten Shore in search of new humans sent here by the spell. Today was the day of the winter solstice, and that meant that out there in the real world, thousands upon thousands of sleepers were currently preparing to enter the pods and arrive in the dream realm. Sunny sighed. Just don't bring back anyone as irritating as you, all right? Kai chuckled. No promises. With that, he waved them goodbye. Well, wish me luck. A few moments later, he was gone, turning into a small in the sky. The remaining 6 people stared at it for a long time, their faces somber. Their future depended on what Kai would discover. Their, and that of everyone else still clinging to life on the Forgotten Shore.